Hi, welcome to a brand new SimplyMaya tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to look at the fundamental principles of rendering within Maya, more specifically within Arnold. So this tutorial will really be suitable for those of you that have Maya 2017 or those of you that have an earlier version with Arnold installed as your render engine. Now we're going to start from first principles, so lights and cameras. Without these things and without being able to set them up, you're really not going to get very far within your rendering. So after we've had a look at the various different light types and their uses within Maya, we're going to look at specific light types within Arnold and their uses. We'll then move on to materials, camera setup, and finally AOVs, or as Arnold calls them, or render passes as you might know them as, so we can split the render up into its various different lighting components and then put that back together in a post-production environment. Now this has normally been left for more advanced tutorials, but in a modern render situation you should be in a position to really split your render up into its component parts so you can do the post-production work on it, whether that be Nuke, Photoshop, After Effects, whatever your post-production application is. So we really will start from the basic fundamentals on this, from how to set up a basic lighting scheme, how to deal with global illumination with image-based lighting, when to use an area light, when to use a point light. So I wanted to make this a fundamental series but with an actual end result. So the end result that we'll get from this will look something like this. In fact, it'll look exactly like this. So not only will we be going through the fundamental principles of rendering lighting within Maya, we'll actually be getting a decent usable result out of it, and this comes split into its various different component parts. So we'll have a lot of flexibility in Photoshop. We'll be able to change the specular highlights, the amount of ambient light or global illumination, the refraction, and finally the subsurface scattering that we'll discuss when we go over the materials. So really, while splitting renders up has been considered a more advanced topic in the past, I now believe we've come to a point in rendering where it should be part of the fundamental process that's done to every image. So this tutorial will really be suitable if you're brand new to Maya, if you've never done any rendering before and you don't know anything about lights or cameras and you really want to understand more about that stuff. It'll also be suitable if you've maybe done this a little bit within Maya but you're new to the new 2017 Arnold render engine that's been brought out now as standard in Maya 2017. So this tutorial is going to be useful if you're not getting the look that you want on your renders. If what's coming out of your render engine is not what you expect, if you're having trouble setting up your lights, if you're rendering with your camera but perhaps what you're seeing on the screen is not actually what you're getting. This is a fundamental course in rendering with some slightly more advanced information thrown in towards the end, all of which goes in to make up the fundamental modern principles of rendering within Maya and within Arnold. So if you've enjoyed our fundamentals series, then obviously this will be a continuation for you. If you haven't, then it's not really necessary to watch the other ones. If you're comfortable with modeling, of course, you can dive straight into this. I'll be providing the scene file for you. So I really hope this has helped some of you guys out, and thank you very much for watching this introduction. Hi, welcome back. So now we've taken a quick look at the kind of scene we want to end up with. First we need to cover a few fundamentals about starting a project in Maya before we start to discuss rendering. So let's first create a project for our folder. So go to File and Set Project, or Project Window rather, and this will allow you to create a new project. And the reason we do this is because Maya internally needs to know where to find certain files. So it will need to know where to find any textures you might use. If you're doing any dynamic type of simulation, it will need to know where to find the cache for that. If you're using the artisan tools, it will need to know where to place temporary images you might be using, and things like this. For you, the important ones are going to be scenes, images, and source images. So where we store our scene files, where our rendered images end up, and where we store any textures that we might be using. And if you go ahead and just hit accept, that will create the project folder for you. So now we're set up to start taking a look at the basics of rendering in Maya. Now in our case we'll end up with Arnold, of course, But there are still certain truisms regardless of the render engine you need, the render engine you use. So it could be V-Ray, it could be Mental Ray, it could be Maxwell, it could be anything, but there are certain things that pretty much all render engines need in order to produce a render. And the first one is something to render. If we hit render now, we're going to come out with a blank screen. And this should be fairly obvious why. There's nothing here. This object on the floor is virtual. It just allows us to chart our position in 3D space, so that won't render. There are no lights in the scene, and even if there were lights in the scene, there would be just a vast expanse of blackness. So let's start out by chucking a couple of objects in here, just to give us something to work with, so we can demonstrate some very, very basic principles of rendering. So let's start out with just a sphere and a cube, and we'll start out here with a ground plane as well, so the light has something to hit. Now I'm going to turn off this virtual grid, and another thing I'm going to do before we proceed is when we're recording these videos, you'll notice that we have this gradiated blue background here, which I think has been with us since Maya 2012. Now, this doesn't do very well on screen capture recordings like the one I'm doing here. So I'm going to hit Alternate and B to change the color of it. Now I'm going to use this grey. If you keep hitting Alt B, it will cycle through the colors available for you for the viewport. This can come in very handy if you're doing a screen capture, you don't have time to render, or if you're doing a play blast, basically an animated screen capture. Then you might not always want that gradiated blue background. But you don't have to change it to follow along with this. That's simply done just so you can see this better on the video, because the video itself actually struggles to record for some reason with that blue background in there. Right, so now we have some objects and we can render again, and exactly as you would expect to happen, we end up with blackness. Now the reason I point this out is because in earlier versions of Maya, Maya had a default lighting. So if it detected that you had no lights in the scene, it would come along and place a couple of default lights in there, so you would at least see something. That's no longer the case. So it catches a few people out sometimes. You need lights to render. So let's just go create a light. Let's create and I'll get into different light types in the next part, but for now we're just looking at the very basics of what we need to get a picture on that render view, really. So let's create a light. This is a directional light. It's a basically infinite light with no decay. Now that makes it rather unusual in Maya. You can see here it's got 3 arrows on the end, 4 actually, and whichever direction this is pointing is the direction the light will go in. So if we just point it at the floor, we will get an infinite light coming in at the floor. More about that later. Right now, let's see if now we actually render a picture, which we should indeed do. Okay, so you can see here that we've got pretty much what we see here in the viewport. So now we've got a light, we've got some objects. The final thing we need to be able to render accurately is a camera that is actually showing us what we're going to see in this view, because it looks close, but it's not spot on. Let's do this a bit better, shall we? Let's get this. So I want to render this sphere, really carefully coming in and adjust it here. I want the sphere to fill up this entire render view here, which is exactly as it does on my screen. Let's render it. Okay, it doesn't, does it? Here it does. You'll see it's right at the bottom and the top, and here it's not. It's quite a bit out. Now, in a case like this, of course, you would just move the camera a bit forward until you cut the top and bottom of the sphere off, and then render again, and try and get it there. But as you can see, that's going to be very awkward, and that is also entirely dependent. Now it's kind of at the top and the bottom. Now I've kind of chopped this off. That's also entirely dependent on how you might have your Maya laid out. So for instance, if we have this attribute editor out here, you can now see that this looks completely cut off in this viewport. So if I zoomed out once again to render it just at the top and the bottom, let's render it again, you'll note that this is now nowhere close to what we actually expected. Look, this looks like we're doing a fine job. I don't know why that decided to render again, excuse me folks. This looks like it's doing a fine job, and then you look at this and you think, no, that's not what I wanted at all. So there are, of course, ways to combat this in Maya. Let's bring our attribute editor back. The reason I bring it back is generally when you're doing things in Maya, you're going to have the attribute editor, channel box, or the modeling tools open on this side of the screen. So let's take a look at this. Maya has something called a resolution gate, which will allow you to see what it is that you're going to actually render. So let's go up here and turn it on. Now you can see here, if you hold your mouse over any of the little icons in Maya and then look down towards here, you'll see a little tooltip. So you can see we have a resolution gate here, and this will show us exactly what we're going to be rendering, regardless of what our viewport screen size is doing. Now you'll notice we've got this big border around it, and you'll notice when we flick the attribute editor away, we haven't. So now we can't actually see the top and bottom of the screen if we go to render. So this becomes an issue, especially when you're rendering odd size images, but this can be tweaked, of course. You click this little icon here, which will be the camera you're currently looking through, whatever that camera may be. If you click here, it will bring up the camera attributes here in the perspective shape. And of course, we'll have a part on cameras. You can't render without knowing how to use a camera, the same way you can't take a picture without knowing anything about your camera. So at the moment we've got this, and this is quite annoying. There's too much space around it. So if we scroll all the way down here to environment, not environment, display options, and look at the overscan. If we have an because the overscan controls this masked area around here. So let's put the overscan to 1.1, and all of a sudden that masking doesn't become quite such an issue, but we'll still see exactly what we want to render. So this time I'm going to get that sphere exactly top and bottom where I can see this, and I'll even do it on the left. So exactly top, bottom and left, or within a millimeter or two, and let's render, and you'll see that what we get is a sphere that's here, as we would expect it to be. Okay, so now we match on our render view exactly what we have in this view. So that is one of the key elements to getting a render. You need to be able to first have something to render, of course. You need to have some light with which to render it. You need to light it up, and you need to have a camera like this one that will show you exactly what it is you're going to render. And you might need to change this overscan based upon the properties here in the viewport. So for instance, if we got rid of the attribute editor, you can see this no longer works, because we know if we render this, that will be exactly at the top of the screen. So if we bring the attribute editor back and put the overscan at say 1.7, you notice it gets a lot smaller here, but when we're working in that bigger window, now once again we can see exactly what we're doing. So that was probably a bit large on the overscan. I mean, you can of course go down to 1.6, let's say, and that way you don't have quite so much of it. So you really need to know what your camera is going to show you when you render. There is no point, I've seen quite a few people that have missed this very, very simple concept, spent many hours setting up a complex render, many hours rendering it, only to find out that what they actually rendered was not what they thought their camera was pointed at. So it's a very, sort of seems very obvious, but it's one of those things that's very easy to overlook, especially when you first start. So that was it for this part. I'm going to keep this one very simple. Just remember, there's a few things you need. You need a camera that's going to show you what you're rendering. You need some lights, and you need some objects to render. That's the very, very basics of going from a viewport view to a rendered view. Okay, so when we come back, we're going to look at lights, light properties, what decay is, intensity, light colors, how to do your shadows, and all that kind of good stuff. I'm going to go through the basic Maya lights first, because most of the basic Maya lights work with Arnold. There's actually a separate Arnold section within them, which also cover. And then we'll look at the Arnold specific lights. From there we'll move on to materials, and hopefully through the course of this tutorial you'll get a very good understanding of why Maya renders the way it does, how Arnold works, and how to create your own renders. So I thank you for watching this part. I know it was quite basic, but this is, as I've said, part of our fundamentals series. So hopefully you picked something up you didn't know, and we're going to get into it a bit more complicated in the next part. So thank you very much. See you in the next one. Okay, welcome back. Now we have the elements we need to actually start to experiment with our lighting and allow me to show you how it works. We've got a camera that knows what we're going to render, we've got a light, and we've got some objects to work with. So let's start off by first off talking about the fact that if I increase the intensity of this light, which does what you would expect, it increases the intensity, I have no feedback of that whatsoever in this viewport. If I change it like so, no feedback again. Now, of course, I could render this to see what the different intensity was like. There are ways of interactive rendering, which we'll go into in a second, but it is nice to have some kind of feel for what's happening in your own viewport. So we can go up to lighting and go use all lights. And this will allow us to give us a very basic view. And I do say that, very basic view. It is definitely no substitute for a render, of course, but it will give you a very basic overview of where your light is pointing. If you want to see the shadows, you can go up and tick shadows, and then all of a sudden you can see the shadows here on the floor. You can get an idea of where your light is pointing, and it's a little more interactive. The intensity will also now kick up the intensity a notch, because that's going to do what you would expect it to do, and the color will change the color. So that's one way, but that's only the broadest of overviews. This doesn't work in quite a number of circumstances. It won't work with subsurface scattering, it does a very poor job of translucency, it does a very poor job of reflectivity in most cases, it does a very poor job of specular highlight placement, and it doesn't do the best job in the world of shadows. So it really is more of a broad overview than something you should actually rely on. You want to be test rendering all the way through the process. Which brings us to the Arnold render view. Now, for the first kind of 10 minutes of this tutorial, we've had a quick look at the Maya render view, which is this one. So you can just pop it open here and hit render. I think that was the last render that we did, possibly, but there we go. So that's what, it's Arnold render up here, and we've got the render view. It's fine at what it does. There is a render view that's built into Arnold, however, that would be better for our purposes. So if you click the Arnold tab, or you can indeed get to it on the shelf here, Arnold, and you've got here Arnold render view, and just render straight off. So let's open the Arnold render view. First thing you'll see, it's slightly different. We've got a play button up here, which will activate an interactive photographic render, an IPR. So we click it, we get basically what we got in Maya. The difference is that we can now do this in sort of a live manner. Now this is a bit sluggish on my machine at the moment because I'm actually recording this video as this is going on, and both recording video and having an IPR render view open or an Arnold render view open are both very CPU intensive. So this should be a little snap here for you guys at home, but this really allows us to dial in on what we're seeing, especially with a simple scene like this. Of course, if I change the light, the Arnold render view will update, and we're getting pretty close to what we're seeing in the viewport. Now, this is not always going to be the case. As I said, the viewport supports a rather limited number of things when it comes to rendering. So if you want this to stop at any time, you can just push the stop button, and as you can see, I can now whiz around without that in the background. If I hit play, then of course that will start to render again. Okay, now we're going to go over these basic options. As I say, you would expect these to update in both views. They do, so we're all good there. The intensity will control how intense your light is. Illuminate by default, it just allows you to turn the light off or back on again. Emit diffuse, does the light emit a diffuse contribution? So yes, pretty much all lights do. Emit specular, again, pretty much all lights do. There are circumstances where you might want to highlight the specular on an object by placing a special light that didn't affect the diffuse, and you can do that, but by the mainstay, these are all going to be ticked by default. Now, these are the Maya light settings. So if you were using Maya's software renderer, that's what you get. That would be the lot. You'd be able to change the color and the intensity, and you'd be done. But we're using Arnold, so we have a lot more options available to us. So let's tick open the Arnold tab, and the first one we see that does confuse quite a few people is exposure. Now this is a value expressed in f-stop basically. So if I change this exposure to say 4, it's going to be a lot brighter than if I was to change, let's say, this intensity to 4. Okay. Now, there is a formula on Solid Angle's website for how this works, but it's really quite simple. In this kind of case, all you need to know is changing the exposure will give you a higher level of light than changing the intensity at a smaller number. So for instance, if we change the exposure to 4, in order to get that bright with the intensity, we'd probably need to change it to, say, 8. So then there's the question of which one do you use, which one is better to use. Well, the question is, which one are you comfortable with? Are you more comfortable expressing light in terms of exposure, or are you more comfortable expressing light in terms of intensity? If you come from a traditional photographic background, you'll probably be more comfortable with exposure. If you come from a more traditional 3D background, you'll probably be more comfortable with intensity. And indeed, you can use them in parallel. I normally leave the intensity set at 1 and tweak the exposure. But again, it depends on what you're used to dealing with, realistically. So you'll see here on the Arnold view there, my shadows tended to disappear. Let's see if we can get them back. No, and this has happened to me a few times in Arnold. Generally, it's just a case of shutting the Arnold render view and reopening it. So there we go, shadows are back. But when you're playing around with a lot of light attributes like we just did, sometimes it gets a little confused. I'm going to zoom in for this next portion. So, the very basics of your light, intensity or exposure, which one do you adjust to change the brightness? The real answer is you can use either. It depends what you're comfortable with. If you're going to use intensity, you'll find yourself using higher numbers. So if you're using lights with lots of decay on them, so you need a very, very strong light source to do a gradual decay, that might be an intensity of, say, 10,000, where it would only be an exposure of 100. Now, both of these values might end up producing exactly the same amount of light, but one number is bigger than the other one. Does it matter? Again, circumstances, what you're more comfortable with and what the team of people around you is more comfortable with. So use either, use them both in conjunction with each other. There is a very simple formula on Solid Angle's website to convert one to the other. So use the one you're comfortable with, and if somebody comes to you later on and says, can you convert the exposure to intensity or the intensity to exposure? The answer is yes, you can, quite easily. So again, whichever one you're comfortable with. Now this brings us on to color, which is here, and then color temperature, which is here. And these are slightly different. This is a color temperature on the Kelvin scale, which I've never seen before. I can pop open here. So this is the Kelvin color temperature scale. So at a value of 10K, you'd have bright blue sky. So if we turn on the color temperature and set it to a value of 10K, I'm going the wrong way, you'll see my render goes very blue. Whoops. My mouse just tweaked there and set it to a value of 1000. Let me just see. So I set it to around 10K. You can see it's quite blue. If we look at our corresponding temperature scale, yep, that's correct. If we set it to 1K like I just did by accident, you would expect it to go pretty red, which, indeed it does. There you go. So that's Kelvin temperature. It's used to mimic sunlight. It's very useful for mimicking sunlight. It's also very useful for doing kind of soft interior light bulbs and stuff like that. Again, you can get pretty much the same effect with the color up here. And again, it's just one of those things that you might or might not be comfortable with. Again, if you come from a traditional photographic background, you're going to be used to a temperature scale, expressing light, color, and temperature. If you come from a more 3D background, you're going to be more used to expressing light in color. So they both have their uses. If I'm doing a sunlit scene, I'll generally use temperature scale. If I just want to create a bright green sci-fi light, then of course I'll go up to the color up there, because the temperature scale is really used for shades of natural light, so from red to blue. If you want a funky neon purple, then you're going to need to use the color. But something else you should be aware of, which you might not have noticed, you'll notice that the color is changing here in the viewport. So let's get a rather extreme one. There we go. The color is changing here, but it's not changing in the viewport. So the viewport doesn't actually support color temperature. It does support color. So again, The viewport is not always the answer, hence why we keep this little interactive render up here, just to give us a better overview of what's actually going on. Now, with the directional light, we've got very sharp shadows, and that's actually pretty true to what you would expect to see in real life, because the sun is so far away and it's an infinite light source. You wouldn't expect the shadows from sunlight to spread out a lot, and they really don't in most circumstances. But if you want them to spread out more than this, because this is razor sharp, you can change it. So a realistic value for sunlight is sort of 0.5. You can see an ever so slight softening of shadow up there. Of course, if you want, you can increase it to say 10, and you'll get a humongous softening of shadow. Now, which brings us nicely into the next setting, which is number of samples. And if we look here on our object, I'm going to have to really zoom in for this, but you can see it's really grainy. Okay, now this doesn't show up so well because it's sort of grainy on a grey background on a grey sphere, so it becomes quite difficult to see. Sometimes you can get away with it if an image is a riot of colour, for instance, lots of textures, lots of pictures, then the grain looks like film grain and can actually add to realism. However, you know, a lot of the time you really don't want this intensely grainy surface, so you can give the light more samples. Now this can be done on a global basis through the render settings, which we'll get on to later, or on a per light basis. I would recommend you do this generally on a per light basis, because increasing the number of samples will drastically increase render time. We're not talking about an increase from sort of 10 seconds to 15 seconds, we're talking about an increase from 10 seconds to an hour and a half. So don't just go into all your lights, don't go to the global setting for this and go, oh, let's have 100 samples because that will make it perfect. Yeah, it might, but you might be rendering until next Christmas. So, you know, as we haven't even hit June yet, it might take a while. So selectively go up in stages till the grain is at the point where you can live with it. Now this is slightly better, it took a lot longer to render. You can see this is better. If we put the samples to say 10, even this simple image, it's rendering, it's still rendering, it's still rendering. You can see here we have the grain. You'll notice this grain here is because the image is actually still rendering. Still rendering. So as things get more complicated, I think it just finished rendering. You can see we've got rid of most of that grain issue, or certainly a lot of that grain issue, by putting the samples up to 10, but it took 30 times as long. So if you've got a base render with a base render time, if your render time was 1 second and you increase this to 10, and this is not a formula guys, it completely depends on the image, but in our case we had a base render of 1 second, we increased that to 10, we went up to 30 seconds, so 30 times longer it took to render, which means if you had a base time of an hour, it's going to take over a day to render. It doesn't always work like that, but just do be aware that by increasing those samples to get rid of noise isn't always the best way to do it, and certainly not globally. If you have 10 or 12 lights in your scene, there might only be a couple that are causing noise. If you just go into global settings, if you were to go up here into the Arnold render settings, so Arnold render, and just start, oh yeah, I'm going to have tons of diffuse rays, diffuse samples, tons of camera anti-aliasing, you're going to get into problems, and we'll look at those when we have something a bit prettier to render than this, but just bear it in mind. Some settings do have a huge impact on render time. It's one of them. So what else have we got here to play with in this light? Directional lights tend to be fairly simple. As I say, they're just mimicking infinite sunlight. So you will have, of course, shadow density, which just defines how dense your shadows are. But you'll see, again, it's something the viewport doesn't affect, isn't affected by. So you're going to need this render view for this. Now, effect volumetrics. Well, we are not doing any volumetrics in Arnold within this tutorial, but this, and again volume sampling, but this could be something like how light was shining through a fog volume. So think about sort of God rays coming through a window. This is not something we're going to be dealing with in this simple fundamentals course, but that's basically what it's for. So look here. The last thing we need to be aware of is these are all the contributions that this light makes on all of these different things. So how much does this light affect the diffuse? How much does it affect the specular? How much does it affect SSS objects? Now, to do a physically accurate render, you're going to want to leave all of these at 1. But it's 3D and we cheat a lot, of course. So sometimes if you wanted to backlight a subsurface scattering object, you had, let's say, a bowl of jello or you know, something with a lot of subsurface scattering on it, something a human ear that you were shining a light through, and you wanted to really exaggerate that subsurface scattering effect without lighting the rest of the character up too much, you could come in here and say, okay, this light does affect the diffuse, it does affect the specular, but it affects the subsurface scattering more. Now you'll see our render update, but we have no subsurface scattering materials in it, so did nothing. But we do have diffuse materials in it, so if I turn that up, you'll see the light now has a greater contribution on the diffuse. Okay, so Arnold does give us, and I just hit the stop button there to stop this because we don't need it right now. So Arnold does give us a greater set of controls than Maya would on its own. So really the controls you'll use most are the exposure, unless you decide to just use intensity, which again is fine. The angle, which will change the shadow angle, the softness of your shadows if you like, the samples, which is a very important one, which will control the number of samples the light puts out, which, you know, in essence controls the quality of the light, and then the contribution to the various different material surfaces that this light will have. So how much specular, how much subsurface scattering, how much indirect light, how much diffuse light. Okay, so that's the basics of Arnold lights. Pretty much all the lights have these controls. A lot of them have extra controls, which we'll get into in the next part. So we've gone from, you know, rendering nothing. Now at least we have a camera we can use, we have a viewport that's slightly more useful for seeing where the lights go, and we have, you know, a broad overview of light. Now one last thing about this directional light is that, as I think I mentioned, it's a little different to most Maya lights in the fact that it doesn't decay. So, you know, I can demonstrate that very, very quickly here by just coming in, and I think I seem to have closed that render view down. There we go, just starting it again. So you'll notice that the floor plane is equally illuminated, and if I move the light, it's still equally illuminated. It doesn't matter where the light is in this particular instance. Now with most lights, of course, the closer they get to an object, the brighter that object gets, but with this one, it does not matter. The only thing that matters with a directional light, as I think I probably mentioned, is the angle of the light. Okay, because it's set to mimic a kind of infinite sunlight. So, you know, sunlight's going to light up your house, your neighbor's house, and, you know, so on and so forth, the next city across, whereas your bedroom bulb, your ceiling light, your traditional wall light, it's only going to light up a very, very small area. Alright, so we're going to come back, we're going to look at some other lights, some that do care where you put them, as well as the angle that you put them at, and some other options within those lights that, you know, give you a little more control than just one great big burst of sunlight. So thank you for watching this. I hope there was something in there you found interesting and helpful, and I'll see you in the next part. Cheers. Hi, welcome back. So in the previous part we had a look at the directional light in Maya and used that to demonstrate some of the attributes and some of the differences between Maya's standard light attributes and the one Arnold brings to the table. Now I want to show you some different lights, because this light isn't sensitive to where we move it, neither is it sensitive to how we scale it. And some lights are, some lights aren't. So let's look at one that's sensitive to movement. So we're just going to create lights point light, And a point light works like a 360-degree sphere of light. So if I just shove this over here, you can see that this definitely is influenced by where it moves. But if I rotate it, no influence whatsoever. It's a 360-degree sphere, so as you can imagine, it's putting light out from every angle. It's not going to be influenced by rotation. This time it's going to be influenced by movement. Scaling and point light won't do anything for you. Again, so not influenced by scale, movement this time instead of rotation. Now point light's probably one of the easiest lights to understand in Maya, just a 360-degree ball of light. Think light bulb, basically. So, you know, if I lift it higher up, my shadows are going to come in. If I push it further down, obviously those shadows are going to lengthen, just as you would expect in a very much a real-world light. Now, if we render this with Arnold, this will probably be extremely dark, because we've got the intensity of this light set at 1 and we've got no exposure on it at all. So let's come in and set the exposure to 5 just so we can deal with a fairly bright light source, and you'll see it decays. So the floor here is much darker than the floor here, and as I move that down towards the floor, you'll see we get an intensely bright hot spot where the light is nearly touching the floor, and then a darkening. Now, if you look under Maya's attributes, within the directional light, all of the Maya attributes worked. Within the point light, they don't. Decay rate, you can set to quadratic, which will definitely update your viewport a little bit. Or quadratic, your viewport updates. But if you watch the render, I can go from no decay to cubic, which is the maximum decay under Maya, and it doesn't change. It's just going to update the viewport. It's not going to have anything to do with your render. So you can leave this light with some decay for the viewport, just so it more matches what you're going to see in your render view. But down here under the Arnold tab is where Arnold deals with decay, and it only has two types: quadratic, which is a fairly realistic type of light decay, or constant. Now constant's just going to be a absolutely constant light source. It's not recommended that you use it. I think of very, very few circumstances when I would want that not to be set to quadratic, and that goes to all light types in Arnold. If you're interested in getting a realistic render and you're not doing something incredibly specialist where you might need a sort of constant no decay sci-fi light, maybe some weird space thing, I really can't think of a good example off the top of my head. Rarely used it myself. It's there, so you know you can use it. There are circumstances when you would, but for the mainstay, you're going to want your scenes to be fairly realistic. Even cartoon scenes need, you know, some form of realistic light drop off. You know, so regardless of whether you're going for photorealism, cartoon, even a little surrealism, you generally don't want the scene to be illuminated like, you know, it's got a 4,000 watt spotlight shining down on it from a great height. So again, recommended to use the decay type quadratic, and everything else in here is pretty similar to what we went over before. So the samples are going to control the quality of the light, how noisy it is, in a word, for, you know, for rendering. Your shadow density, of course, it's going to turn down the density of your shadows, and again, I'm not going to cover everything here. Color temperature we've done before, and that's pretty much it for this light. So this is basically a light bulb. It's usable in scenarios where you would need a light bulb shaped light, and that's really that simple. It's sensitive to movement, it's not sensitive to rotation, and it's not really sensitive to scaling. There's a few other things you can do with it, but by the mainstay, you're going to use a point light when you need a spherical light source. Let's take a look at another one. So I'm going to turn the render off for a second and go create lights. Now the reason I went to directional light and not ambient light is because ambient light does not work in Arnold. As you can see, we get absolutely nothing. It's not a useless light, it's very useful for lighting up the viewport. The reason why it doesn't look like there's anything here is because ambient light doesn't cast shadows and everything here is the same color. Ambient light can be useful for lighting up the viewport to do viewport 2 animations. So if you're looking to just do a screenshot, you can use an ambient light to help soften the shadows in the viewport, basically. So if we come in and just create a, let me show you what I mean, directional light. So we know these not going to work. You'll see me move these directional lights, and as I've said, it doesn't matter where you put them. The only reason I move them is so I can get them off the floor plane, so I know where they are. Now let's take a look. Let's say you wanted to just do a screen capture here and send this to a friend, a colleague, to say, hey look, does this look okay? Well, you know, it doesn't, does it? Because this is extremely dark and these are extremely dark. So for viewport purposes, for taking a play blast, for taking a snapshot of the screen, the ambient light can come in quite handy. So let's create a lights ambient light. You'll see here we've blown everything up and give it an intensity of say 0.2, maybe a bit high, 0.1, and now we've softened all the light in our scene, we've softened the shadows, and you know, with a combination of lights you can get, and the ambient lights not going to care where you put it, it's just ambient light. So I normally use a very low level of ambient light in conjunction with maybe a directional light when I'm doing a screen cap for a friend. Just makes things look a bit nicer, or it can certainly be used for that. It can also be used for lighting up hardware fog and other things, you know, in the viewport. So just because you can't render it doesn't mean it's been made redundant. So let's go to create lights. Let's create one we can actually render. Let's look at the spotlight. Spotlight's an interesting one. Again, it is sensitive to movement, as you can see. Let me flip this up so it's pointed at the floor, and we'll get a better view of it. So I'm just going to point it straight down, and I'm going to lift it up. And as you can see, as I lift that up, that is going to widen the spotlight angle, as you would expect, because you know, the higher up it gets, the bigger the angle is going to get. Now you can, of course, make that angle bigger, but as you'll see, not by scaling it, because by scaling it, all you're going to do is scale it to here. Now, it's not recommended that you scale it like this. If you want it bigger, you can actually use the light properties itself. So again, this is one that's sensitive to movement, not necessarily scaling. I certainly wouldn't scale one of these lights to get it to the shape I want. And if you do scale it, all it's going to really tell you is where the light's falling. And if you're using all lights in your viewport, you can already see where the light is falling. Another good trick for something like a spotlight is to use it as a camera. If you need to get precise placements, go to Panels, look through Selected. And now I'm actually looking through the spotlight. So if I want to aim my spotlight at the sphere, you know, I could just come in and I'm navigating this spotlight like it was a camera. So let's point it at that side of the sphere. Oops. It's actually quite difficult because its controls are a bit fiddly, but there we go. So Panels, Perspective, Perspective. And as you can see, I've pointed that spotlight at that circle, exactly where I expected to. So you can use that look through the shape to kind of dial your spotlights in. But let's say we wanted a much wider spotlight. So we've already seen that scaling it uniformly doesn't work. Scaling it any other way is really not the right thing to do. But let's come in and take a look at its attributes. Now I've got a cone angle of 40. If I move that out, you can see I get a much bigger cone. Okay, so the penumbra angle is going to give you either a drop off towards the inside, like so, or a drop off towards the outside, basically. And then you can use a global drop off to kind of soften your spotlight up a bit, depending on the look you're going for. You know, sometimes you're going to want a very sharp spotlight, sometimes you're going to want a very fuzzy one. Let's have a look at that in Arnold. So we're going to see if this matches what we're seeing in Arnold, and it doesn't, because that's rendered. I can see, just detect a tiny bit. You probably won't be able to see it in the video. And once again, we've got an intensity of 1 and an exposure of nothing. So let's put the exposure to 5, and then we can see our spotlight. Let's maybe put it to 6, so it's a bit brighter. Now we can see our spotlight. So it is behaving pretty much like it is in the viewport, and it is a simple spotlight. Again, you can come down and adjust the aspect ratio of it in Arnold. You'll notice that doesn't update on the viewport. But if you want to squash it and get an elliptical spotlight, well, this aspect ratio is quite handy. Now you've got the lens radius, which will pull it out, push it back a bit. You know, these controls for the spotlight, fairly self-explanatory. Again, you can do some softening of the shadows caused by the spotlight. There we are, you can see them, fuzzy shadows here. There we go, and you can see they're not very well quality, and we have a lot of noise because we don't have a lot of samples. But we don't need it. For test rendering, you want to keep your samples quite low. You don't want to be sitting here for 5 minutes. So, radius 0.5, very, very, very sharp shadows with just a hint of softness here. So again, depends on the look you're going for, how soft you would want the shadows for this. Now there are a couple of kind of cool things you can do with the spotlight. You can use barn doors for it, which are basically if you had a spotlight in real life and instead of circular you wanted it square, just closed off a bit. Spotlights in real life, you've probably seen them, have metal panels on the outside that you can fold in to shape the light. Well, we can also do this in Arnold. We can go back here to these light filters, hit add, and for this we want barn doors. Okay, so there it is. We just double click it. You can see we can influence the barn doors. So left, and let's do the bottom. Let's close it up here, and using these controls I can then do a slither of light through the center of the screen. In our case, through the center of the screen. So, barn doors, very, very simple way to create light effects, like a slash of light coming into a room from a half-open window. You don't actually need to model said half-open window and then shine a light through it and let the computer work out, how that light would fall. You can actually just grab a spotlight, chuck it in the corner of the room, point it towards where you need that slash of light to come in. So if you're doing a render of somebody's living room and you need a slash of light coming through the curtains, but you don't actually want to go to all the trouble of modeling the curtains and the window and the wall and everything else, because the camera's never going to turn in that direction, but you want to give the people looking at the scene the impression that there's a window with a kind of slash of light coming through. Very simple way to do it. Not time consuming at all. You have to model a bunch of extra stuff, you don't have to rely on it, and it's extremely flexible. You can get very tight angles, you can basically create whatever shape you could want by covering up certain points of that light. So let's get rid of these. If we click on the light again, we'll go back to it. Let's disconnect that, have a look at what else we can play with a spotlight. So we can look in here and we could add, let's say, a gobo. Now this, often called a cookie, will allow us to put a complex piece of thin metal in front of the light. So if you imagine if you had a very bright spotlight and you wrote your name in cut out letters and then you shove that over the spotlight, what would shine through the spotlight would be your name. I think places like restaurants and stuff use these to shine on the ground in front of the restaurant, so when you're walking along you can see the name of the restaurant lit up on the sidewalk. Stuff like this. They're used a lot in theatres to create, well, things like window effects. So you can use a spotlight with a gobo on it or a cookie to shine at the stage to make the audience think that somewhere over the back of the stage is an open window. So a bit like barn doors, but dealing with much more complicated shapes. So let's go here, double click our gobo, and we need a slide map. A slide map is going to be a black and white image generally of what you want your gobo to look like. So here's one. Let's say we wanted this pattern projected on the floor. Let's open that up. Arnold will convert it to its particular format, and there we go. Now we've got a complex light pattern. Now this one doesn't particularly make sense, but you could create a complex stained glass window pattern, let's say, and project that into a room, and then Robert's your father's brother. You've got a complex stained glass window without having to actually go through all the trouble of making it, shining light through it, which is very time consuming in rendering terms and very time consuming in your terms too. Now, of course, you can change the scale of this. So if we scale it 2 and 2, you'll see it come in here. You can change the position of it with the offset. So 0.1, you'll see it moves over. You can change how dense it is, so we can make it more or less dense. A few things you can do. Basically, this is all I'm going to show you. We're not going to be using a gobo or barn doors. for lighting our scene, I just wanted to bring it up that it is possible to create very, very complex shapes, shadows on the ground without actually having very complex objects in the scene. I used a gobo on many occasions. I've used one in a mental ray tutorial on SimplyMaya to have it look like there was lots of trees outside a window and the sunlight was shining through the trees, because you don't actually want to go to the trouble of modeling a whole bunch of trees. You can use, in essence, a complicated gobo pattern, black and white pattern, to create interference pattern with the light to make anything you want, from a simple sort of 4-pane window to a very complex stained glass window to, you know, your name in lights on the floor to, in my example, shadows of trees. So a couple more Maya lights for you. Let's get rid of this one. So let's go to create lights, and the one we've missed really is volume light, which won't work in Arnold. Arnold has another way of dealing with volumetric lights, and ambient light, which we've covered already. Now you'll notice we've missed area light, and this is a real big light in Maya. It's used a lot. It allows you to create a light of an area. So let me bring one in and I'll show you. So I'm going to kill the render view off here for a moment. Now an area light acts like so. So it's a disk that you can scale up and down, you know, whatever size you want, and it's sensitive to movement and it's sensitive to rotation. It gives off lovely soft shadows, although not in the viewport, of course. You need to render to get those, you know, or at least a realistic impersonation of what this light is going to do. It's one of the more useful lights within Maya. It's used, as I've mentioned, quite a bit. Now, I'm not going to use this one. The reason is, as we've seen so far, pretty much all lights that we've used have had this area light attribute here, or, you know, whatever their light attribute is, be they point lights, be they directional lights, or spotlights. They've had a little bit here with Maya in them, and then we've gone down to this Arnold tab, and, you know, the attributes to change the Arnold particular parameters have been sitting right here. With this light, that's not the case. If you are using Arnold and you know you're only going to be using Arnold, get rid of it. Go up to Arnold, create lights, area light. Now, in the past, these have been the same thing. You'll notice that this one is going to be working here in our viewport. Let me just find it. There we are. So it works in our viewport fairly similarly to the last one. And in fact, it looks the same. It's got this little tail indicating which direction the light will be coming from. It reacts to rotation and it reacts to movement. So what's the difference? Well, the biggest one being that now you'll see we've got no Maya controls. Intensity and exposure are on top of each other. There's no separate section for Arnold. It's just all Arnold. This light is an Arnold light made specifically for Arnold. And because of that, if you use the Maya one with the added Arnold attributes, you do not get all the controls that you should be getting. So specifically the light shape, which in this case can be a cylinder or it can be a disc. Now both of these have their uses. If you want a more circular light, a disc is great. If you want to surround something, or you want to create a lampshade that has a light that goes around like a cylinder, this can be useful. If you want to just create a flat screen of light, then this can be useful too. So let's go in and crank up the exposure, and let's take a render and see what this light looks like, because there's a few other properties with it as well. So I'm going to hit O, and I'm going to show you something now, that this light is sensitive to scale, but in a quite specific way. Let me get it so I can see these shadows on the floor, and I'm going to want a bit more intensity, a bit more exposure, so I can see those shadows better. So you can see behind our ball here we have a very, very, very soft shadow, and that's kind of physically accurate in this case. This light is a huge light. It's going to create a huge soft shadow. If we push this down so it's much, much smaller, you'll see in the viewport that the light got a lot less, but in this view the light stayed the same. In fact, if I turn the lighting on default for the viewport, because it's often quite tricky to see when you've got both on the screen, but look here, we have very, very hard shadows now, and we have this amount of light. Now you would expect when I scaled a light like this up that I would create more light. I'm creating more area on the surface, more photons coming out, more light. But watch what happens. The light stays the same. The shadow gets massively softer. Okay? So this can really be used to tweak soft shadows. But I hear you cry, what if I wanted an area light when I scaled it up? I want the intensity to change. And yeah, of course, it's easily done. We'll go on and tick this, which we haven't looked at, normalize. Now with this ticked, we're going to be using the intensity from intensity and exposure, combination of the two, or just one or the other, depending on how you're using it. And this will just now predominantly affect shadows, how soft they are. With normalize turned on, that's how it works. With normalize turned off, the actual light intensity, and you can still change the light intensity here as well. So let's put that back on 7. But if I scale this now, the light intensity will scale correspondingly. So this means that if I wanted a massively soft shadow, type that would be given off by a huge harsh light, well, I'm going to also end up with a huge harsh light, which is sometimes good, sometimes bad. Now, of course, you could change the shape of this light to suit your needs. So this is what it's going to look like as a cylinder. Obviously, you can see that there's no light coming down this way. And as a disc, again, looks fairly similar to the quad light, to the square one. Okay, everything else is pretty much the same. The only difference between using this area light and using this one, which you can find under the standard Maya lights, is that this area light gives you those additional cylinder and disc shapes, which that one doesn't. Now, there are a few settings under here that we'll be going in on the main tutorial. We'll be using these lights in the main tutorial to help light up our car, but it's a very, very interesting light. It's well worth the usage. You know, the way it's kind of affected by so many factors. It's affected by its distance from the object. It's affected by its size if you have normalize off for light intensity. It's affected by its size if you have normalize on for its shadows. And again, even with that off, it still affects the shadows, it just affects the intensity as well. With normalize on, it's only going to affect the shadows. You can see that's getting no more intense as I scale it up and down. I would then have to go and change the intensity up here. Now there are other settings with this. You can change the spread of it, of course, to make it a more focused, more spotlight-like, a more spotlight-like light. That's a bit of a mouthful now I think about it, and a few other things, but we'll be using all this, you know, during the main body of the tutorial when we actually get to light something up, which is what this is all about. So, you know, you've got a spread here, kind of useful. Use it sometimes depending on what you're looking at, and color temperature, it's going to be the same as you've seen before. Everything else is going to be the same. Samples, what else have we got in here? Shadow color, well, you've always got that, depending on what color you want your shadow density, of course, and the contribution the light makes to the scene in terms of its diffuse, specular, subsurface, indirect, and whatnot. But this is by far one of the most flexible lights within Maya, so, I mean, get used to using it. It's also an expensive one to render, because by default you would have a point light, let's say, with an angle attached to it, so you can define the angle of the shadows. So you can say, okay, this point light would have softer shadows than this, but I'm going to cheat a bit, you know, and make them a bit more sharp to save on render time. With an area light, you know, you size it up, you get soft shadows, they're very nice. It can be expensive to render, worth it in a lot of cases, and especially used in combination with a few other things, with a few other lights, you know, to take the heavy lifting of actually lighting the entire scene off an area light, although you can do that. I've done it in the past, lots of people do it. It adds a bit to render time, but sometimes the looks are justified. So let's go down, and when we come back we're going to take a look at some other Arnold lights. So Arnold has some. You have his sky dome, a physical sun and sky. We're not really going to do a lot on this. The sky dome and the physical sun and sky and Arnold are very similar. The physical sun and sky comes connected to a sun and sky node where you can change sky color and light position and whatnot. Light portals we're not going to touch on. They're very useful for pumping light in through windows when you're using a physical sun and sky, but as we're not going to be doing that, I'll save it for another tutorial. As I say, this is a fundamentals course, and I actually have a more advanced Arnold lighting for interiors coming out, so I'll save some things for that will need, you know, a little bit more explaining, maybe a bit too much for this fundamental level. But we'll take a look at the sky dome quickly, the mesh light, the photometric light, and then we'll actually get on with lighting this scene. So I really hope this is interesting to you guys. I hope you're finding something useful in it, something you didn't already know, and I'll see you in the next part when we take a look at that mesh light, photometric light, and sky dome. Okay, thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back. So we finished up by taking a look at some of the Maya standard light types. Now let's take a look at a couple of the more unusual ones. Let's go to Arnold lights, and first off we'll take a look at a mesh light. Now in order to create a mesh light we need a mesh. So in our case, just to make this nice and quick and simple, we'll use a sphere. It can be any mesh you want. NURBs are currently not supported, so you know, you're not going to be able to use a NURB surface, but generally any polygonal shape you're going to be able to use. And this has a variety of uses. If you've got a very specific lighting condition that needs to be met, glowing neon rope for instance, then a mesh light might be just the job you need. We're going to use this sphere just because it's quick and easy to illustrate. But once you've created your mesh to emit light from, you're going to go to Arnold lights, mesh light, and that will turn this into a mesh light. Now if we go to lighting, use all lights, you'll see we've got some sort of representation in the viewport here. Not too bad actually. You know, the viewport's not very good with these newer Arnold lights. So let's turn on our render here, and you can see that this mesh light is emitting very similarly to a point light. Now I'm going to turn the intensity up a bit, the exposure in this case, just so we can get a better look, and let's crank that all the way to 8. Alright, now you'll notice that these mesh lights are quite noisy. It is one of the prices you pay for using them. But if we look down here at the shadow, again with a mesh light, if I increase the size of it, you'll see this shadow gets softer, but the actual light intensity itself, that's not going up. Now this shadow is hugely soft. We are at this sort of light intensity, so we've got a hugely soft shadow here, and we'll scale this all the way down. This is taking a bit of processing with the recording going as well, and we've got a very soft shadow, but again we've got the same light intensity. This, as you can probably have worked out by now, works on the same principle that an area light does with normalized turned on or off. So with normalized turned on or off, the size of the light is going to affect the shadows, not necessarily the intensity. With normalized off, the size of the light is going to affect the intensity as well as the amount of shadows. Now this is completely dependent on the circumstance you need the light for, of course. Sometimes you're going to want a light where you can have direct control of the shadows, so you're going to want a giant light to give you smooth shadows the same way you would with an area light, but you're not necessarily going to want it to be that intense, in which case you want normalize on. It's on by default, and this will allow you to tweak the shadows without necessarily tweaking the overall contribution of the light without going up here. And again, this is going to work like a point light. It's going to be very sensitive to movement, it's going to be very sensitive to direction and even rotation, depending on the style of mesh you have picked for your light. If you're emitting light from a long bar and you rotate it, then obviously this is going to make a huge difference. In a sphere, now the rotation of it's not going to be hugely important, of course, because, well, it's spherical. So it's going to make little difference. You can again use color temperature. This light again has no Maya controls. You can show the original mesh, which will just show the original shapes that you used to create it from. So there, now it's come in. You can see it here in the viewport, and this is a little finicky. Sometimes you've got to click it twice. You can make this light visible. So if you wanted to create a visible mesh light, and this is done quite often, especially with things like neon tubes and weird light shapes that you just can't get out of Maya's standard lights, that's what this is for. The renders tend to be a little more noisy than they would be with a point light. I would say there is no need to do this with a sphere, because you could use a point light to emit a similar sort of light. However, if we wanted a real funky shaped light, let me turn on the, let's just use default lighting for now. So I'll go under lighting, use default lighting. There's the original mesh that we used to create this particular shape. Now let's say we had a very, very oddly shaped light here. So I'm not quite sure what this light would be, but I'm just going to turn this off because it's slowing me down. And I'm just basically, I'm not going to go through what I'm doing particularly, I'm just using soft selection here to create a very weirdly shaped light. Okay, so I think we can all agree that that's a bit of a weirdly shaped light, but if you did need this, you can go lights, mesh light. Okay, let's turn the render back on. Now we're going to need to crank the exposure again to 7, and you see that this is now giving off a really weird kind of light. Okay, I should have deleted the history on this and frozen its pivot and whatnot before I decided to use it, but we're not going to be using unusual mesh lights in this. Just know that you can use unusual shapes and you'll get unusual light patterns. Okay, so there's the original object. Let's get rid of that. So that's mesh light. It's extremely nice to have it. Before, in something like mental ray, you would have to emit light from an object, which is far noisier than this new mesh light in Arnold, and also far more costly to render. So mesh light's extremely useful. You can animate them, which creates some great effects. You can use very, very strange shaped lights, which has been something that's been quite difficult to do in something like mental array for quite a while. So it's very nice to have it. It's not something you're going to be using, every day. Right, let's take a look at a different type of light. Let's take a look at a photometric light. Now these lights mimic real-world lights by using what's called an IES file. So let's get a wall here, because most real-world lights are going to be up against a wall, or indeed, if you need a specific spotlight shape. So, depending on where you buy your lights, if you nip down to, say, IKEA, or, whatever is in your country that's convenient, a lot of the lights you can buy, depending on the lampshades and the shades for them and whatnot, you'll see little pictures of different shapes that the lights would make on the wall. If you go to any manufacturer's website who makes lights, Osram, Philips, people like this, they will have what's called IES files, and this is to help lighting designers make the choice of lights that they want. So if you generally look at an uplighter in somebody's house that's on the wall, you could do that with a spotlight, but it's very rare to find an uplighter that's going to be a perfect spotlight. So you could try and dim the edges a bit. But what if you were doing an ArcViz render and you needed to exactly match the lights the client was going to be buying? So if he's buying Philips Series B-21 amber lights and he wants to see what those would look like in his apartment, can you actually mimic that? The answer is yes. Yes, you can. So with this photometric light, again, you still have exposure, you still have samples, you still have shadow density, you still have intensity, and you still have color temperature, everything you would need. But let's hit play, and we're going to get absolutely nothing. It doesn't matter how close this thing is to the wall. Let's use an exposure of, say, we've been using around 7, nothing. That's because this light This requires one of those IES files. So I've got a few here. If I look down at my projects folder, I've stashed them in the data directory. So you can see I downloaded a few. Now these are all free to download. You can grab them off Philips's website, off Osram's website. If you do a Google search for IES lighting files, pretty much every major manufacturer of lights nowadays supplies these specifically for this purpose. So let's come in here, and there's even some free software kicking around. It's on manufacturers' websites, but you'll find it if you just type IES Viewer, which will allow you to view these patterns without having to render them in Maya. But let's just open this one, and this one's going to do nothing in our viewport. So it's just going to look like a default kind of spotlight-ish kind of thing. That's not how it's going to render, however. So let's render it. And we can see here we've got very little intensity from this light. Let's crank the exposure up to 15, and you can see now we've got massive intensity from this light. So depending on what IES file you load, you can see we've got a bright hotspot in the middle of this one. Let's try another one here on the render. Let's try another one. It's dependent on what pattern you will get. So this has given us a different result again. Let's go down. I think they're probably all part of the same series, those ones. So here we have, this is far too bright, so let's go with 4, probably 7. That's not a 7, that's a 1. There we go. And you can start to see we can create some sort of crazy light patterns here. So let's turn around. And quite difficult to get it. There we go. So you see this shadow pattern here that's created by the light? That is down to this IES file. And of course that will be dependent on how you rotate it, how far away it is from the wall. I mean, if it's a light that's supposed to be a wall hanger, then obviously this would be slap bang on the wall. Let me just stop that for a second while I go with the position of this. So hit play. You can see you get a different light, different shadow pattern from these. Let's bring it out a bit so you can see that a bit more. You can even see the little light stem here. Let's try another one. And I think that might have been the one I just had. And slightly different, slightly narrower. These are all part of a similar series, so I imagine they're all going to come in looking, fairly similar. These ones completely different, of course, completely different IES file. So depending on the light pattern you need, if you need a very, very realistic photometric light, if you need a very specific light, then photometric lights are the way to go. So I'm not going to spend too much time on them. Again, we're not going to be using them in the main body of the tutorial, but I just wanted to make you aware that they existed. So do look at IES files on the internet. Try rendering some yourself. They're great fun. If you're doing an interior scene, they're fantastic. You can actually go to a lighting website, Philips's website, Osram's website, check out all the different lights that they have. They've got light pattern pictures and stuff. Download the IES file, whack it into Maya, get your interior scene render, and you get a great realistic pattern of light and shadow on the wall for your renders. Absolutely terrific without much effort at all. So let's get rid of that. So we've done mesh lights now, and we've done, let's see, under the Arnold lights. Now we've done mesh lights and we've done photometric lights. Light portals are something a bit niche, a bit more specialized. Let's do a sky dome. A sky dome is literally a dome that comes out with an overall level of grey illumination. Let me turn this off, because it does tend to be a bit slow, but as you can see the sky dome around me. It's a 360-degree light, and again, Maya's viewport is treating this a bit like an ambient light, so we're not going to get any shadows off it. So in this case, it would be better to go back to default lighting, because the viewport's just not going to be good for this. But as you can see on the render, this gives off a very pleasant level of just complete light, if you like. Now you can plug in HDRI images into this, high dynamic range images, to use HDR lighting. There's a couple of things you can set it for. So portal mode, when used in conjunction with portal lights, is here now, and I'm using 2017 extension 3, and that's new for extension 3. or at least being that visible. You know, you can set an exposure, you can turn it on and off by default, you can use a color temperature, of course. In this kind of light, that can be extremely useful. Because it is given over a kind of an overall sunset view, and we're actually probably going to use one of these with a HDR image. So we'll just bring a HDR image in. I happen to have one handy. So let's open one up, and we're going to go to, I've stashed it in images, so we've got a few. Now these are studio light in HDRs. So in this part of the image, it's going to give off a brighter level of light than in, say, this dark part of the image. Let's pop that open. Now one thing I would say is with this is a high dynamic range image, 32-bit, so the color space has to change to raw. By default it will be sRGB. You saw mine change to raw, and I shouldn't have done that. I've left a setting on in my personal Maya that won't be on yours. Let me show you. Okay, color management in Maya is now much easier than it was. I will throw in a separate part of this tutorial called color management, because nowadays it's not such a consideration that it was. We'll be doing some during the main body of the tutorial, but what you need to know is the color space under a texture node you bring in should generally be sRGB, unless you're bringing in a 32-bit linear image. And the reason why mine changed by itself, normally it wouldn't, normally it would stay on sRGB, mine changed by itself, is because I've gone to my color management and explicitly told it raw priorities. So if it's a HDR image, then it comes in as raw. If it's an EXR, it comes in as raw. If it's a JPEG, a GIF, or anything else that's not explicitly listed here, then it will come in as sRGB. And I advise you to do this because, generally speaking, if you're bringing a high dynamic range or an EXR image into Maya, it's going to be a linear raw image, and that's what you're going to need this set to. Right, so let's play this now with this HDR image connected to it. So, you know, the resolution will be set fine. Intensity, probably turn off the color temperature actually, because we don't need it. We want to be lit by HDR, not color temperature. And you can see that this is no longer just an overall level of illumination. In fact, if we turn this off so it's not constantly rendering in the background, look round, where that bright light is there is exactly where we are getting the shadow. So depending on what type of HDR image you bring in will depend upon what sort of look you get. So here's another one, and this one is going to create the shadow, I would say, yeah, in this direction. So let's render it again. You'll see that it's very different. It's going to give off much more levels of light, I would probably assume, because most of it is quite bright, but you can still see some definite shadows. It's a definite improvement. Now you can use nature HDRs, sky HDRs, whatever you're going for. Let's just bring in one more here. I don't think we did number 14. Let's see what that looks like. That one will be quite boring. This one might be a little more interesting. Let's bring this one in. So what it's doing is converting the textures to its own internal format. So as we can see, we get a different level of overall lighting with this HDR too. So we're basically image-based lighting right now, and you can of course come in, change the intensity of this, the exposure of it, the format of it. I'm not going to get into that too much. You know, it's set on its default setting, is probably absolutely fine for most of the things we're going to bring in. Certainly the number of samples is the same. Portal mode we won't get into because we're literally not going to be using it. Resolution is how much resolution you want to give the image itself. So if we zoom in fact, let's get a HDR that has a more pronounced shadow. So I think that was number 13, no, number 12 maybe. Yeah, number 12 had a quite pronounced shadow in front of this thing. Let it just calculate, and let us get that to a camera angle. So we can increase the resolution to improve the quality of the HDR, as you would imagine. Let's turn it up to 2K. and you're probably not going to see it get that much better because, again, this is not a very high quality one. We don't have the samples turned up high enough. As you can see, that graininess has started to go away, but our render time has increased quite exponentially. So you can get some very good HDRs. Studio light in HDRs are, something you can actually recreate yourself with the lights in Maya. I like to use them sometimes. Ones like this, very, very quick, makes very quick renders, very quick overall lighting without too much effort on your part. So I might use one with an intensity, say, a bit lower than this, which this will be fairly low, almost pitch black. So I might use this to get an overall level of base illumination and then match my lights to it. Or if I was doing an exterior, I might use one to feed in some lovely exterior color information on the light bounces, because this will bounce back the light. In this case, these studio ones are just black and white. I advise you to experiment. We'll be using one in the main tutorial, just so we can use one really. We'll do a couple of different ways to light. We'll use a couple of different lights, so we get to do a bit of everything. It's not necessarily the quickest way to do it, but I want you guys to see the scene lit with some of the lights we've been looking at, and it doesn't always necessarily have to be the quickest way. You can get better results sometimes with a slightly slower render. If you're doing a still frame, I don't mind that. If I'm doing an animation, a couple of 100 frames, then yeah, you're going to really want to maximize the efficiency of your lights and everything. For a still frame, if it takes an extra 5 minutes, I don't mind so much. So I'll be back in the next part when we're actually going to look at starting to light this up. So we'll open our car scene and we'll start to come in and create the base lights. We'll do a basic 3-point lighting kind of setup, so a key light, a fill light, possibly a rim light, and possibly a HDR, a very sort of low intensity studio HDR. Alright, so thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been of interest to you, and I'll be back in the next part when we'll look at lighting up something that's a little more interesting than a box and a sphere. Hi, welcome back. So I've opened our scene file here, and I'll provide this for you. It's called tutorial start MB. So simply open this up. It will be in your projects folder, and it consists of 2 cars and a whole bunch of Lego here I dropped with bullet physics. So we need to, before we come in and apply some of the lighting techniques that we've learned, or some of the lights that we've learned, before we do anything, we want to take a look at the camera. As I said in a previous part, you can't really do much if your camera is set wrong. So if we come in here, and whether your camera is set wrong or not will entirely depend on the shot that you're trying to get. But for me, the standard Maya camera, when I'm rendering something like this, it's too fisheyed, and I can exaggerate this effect. Let's click here to look at the camera. If I change the focal length to 16mm, there we go. You see the massive fisheye, and this just looks very strange to me. Now, you're going to get all sorts of distortion on this, and that could be what you're looking for. If you want a very wide lensed shot, kind of a fisheyed shot, this would be fine. Because let's have a look at what we can get in shot here. So if I have both of these cars in shot here with a 16mm lens, you can see that I can just about get them both in shot. Lego appears like so. If I change this to 75 and then zoom out to be in the same place, you can see our Lego appears much closer. So depending on the look that you're going for this particular shot, I'm going to use a focal length of 75 because I think it makes our Lego look nice and close. We get much less perspective distortion if we want to go in close, much less lens distortion and whatnot. So depending on how you want your camera to act, you're going to have to come in and change your focal length. Would be the predominant one. Now, of course, this camera is not showing us what we're going to render. So let's come on and turn on the resolution gate. So now we have that resolution gate. You'll notice the masking is off. You can turn it on or off here. That resolution gate, once again, is a little bit too big for me. It kind of bugs me. So I'm going to go for 1.1. just so I don't have so much of it on the screen. Now, before we do anything with materials in this particular scene, so if you followed along with our modeling tutorial, you should have, one of these cars, or both of them. I provided both of them, and indeed we build them both in those tutorials. So you can use your own file by all means. If you want to use your own cars, no problem. You can feel free to steal my pile of Lego bricks there. I'll be doing a bullet physics tutorial later on that shows you how to drop bricks, how to explode the car, how to do lots of cool things with a car basically. But for right now, let's set up some basic lights. So if we go on to lighting and use all lights, obviously we're going to be pretty pitch black here. You can still see the grid. Let's turn it off, it's quite annoying. So let's start with something easy. Let's start with, let's say, a dome light with a HDR on it. So let's go to Arnold, lights, let's go to one of those sky domes. Let's add in our HDR. So file, let's open this up, and I think we chose number 12 was nice for us. So let's grab that number 12. Let's use this HDR light, because we don't want this HDR to be our main light. This is going to be like a backing light for us. So let's grab it and turn it around. It's quite difficult to see. I'm going to press E to rotate. I'm going to shove it all around there. Whoops. Let's grab the right thing. Until this is sort of behind the cars. So if I was going to render from this angle, this will act as a nice little background light. I don't want too much intensity in it. Maybe turn the intensity to 0.2. I'm going to use the resolution at quite small for now. And I'm going to find a camera angle that I want to render these two cars from. Okay, so here seems about fine. Now for now, because we've just got this overall light Maya's treating as ambient, I'm just going to kick on the use, where are we, lighting, use default lighting. Yeah, just slightly easier to see, and we can start to do some test renders of this. So again, Arnold render view. Now we want to make sure that we are set here on a test resolution size that's sensible, and press O to get what size you're actually at. So we want to check what size we're rendering at as well. So under common attributes, HD 450. Okay, that'll do. That's enough to give us a basic example of the intensity of this light. So let's hit go and see if that gives us some form of overall illumination. Now this is actually going to take quite a bit longer than the previous scene, because Arnold's currently looking at all this geometry and getting it ready for the IPR render. Before we had 2 pieces, now we've got several hundred. So it takes it a second, not long, as you see, it's not a huge amount of time to spend, and obviously the render is going to take much longer. It's just the nature of the beast. You add a ton more objects, you're going to get longer render time. Okay, so that rendered in only a few seconds, and honestly I'm quite happy with it for a sort of first blush result. I've got some nice shadows in here, give me a nice ambient kind of feel light source. So let's click this off. What I'm not happy about is the background. So again, because in a render you are going to get this black environment, which you can change. You can change it in post, you can edit something in there afterwards. It will be in the alpha channel. If we come here and change this from RGB to alpha, you'll notice that if we brought this into Photoshop, this part of the image would be transparent. So it would be very easy to fill that in with grey, put a background picture in there or whatnot. But I want to get this whole render in Maya. I don't want to deal with alpha channels right now. Say, this is going to be a very basic, simple render for you to do. It's going to be more of a look at lights, look at materials and stuff like that. So we're not going to really worry about post-production too much. So let's come in and look at why this is happening. Now, of course, we've got a horizon line, which you can see here. So if you were rendering from here, this wouldn't be an issue. It's only when you want to render from sort of floor level that the horizon line, as you know, if you get down on the floor and look down, the horizon line is going to be there. All this is going to be black on the render. I don't like it, so I'm actually going to give this thing a proper backdrop. So let's scale in the floor plane here. And I must have made this thing huge when I was doing this before. Yes, obviously, for some strange reason, no need for it to be that big. There's some sort of fumble-fingeredness on my part, no doubt. Now, I know that I want my render to be kind of from this angle. I want both cars in it. This looks pretty nice to me. You know, you can tweak this later, but for now, let's just get a general view. I'm going to click here, which is the bookmark for the camera. So if I sort of get away with it on my camera, I've got a camera view bookmark. Now, I obviously have some from the previous tutorial in here, but the one you create last will obviously be the biggest number. So for us, that's number 14. So let's take a look at this plane. Now we want to get it straight on to our angle, or as straight as we can get it. It doesn't really matter that much. And then we're going to come in and we're just going to lift this up as part of the backdrop. So let's select an edge. This one should do it. Lift it up. Actually, let's use soft selection on that. So B and middle mouse drag just to expand the soft selection out a bit. And this way I can lift the whole backing plate up. There we go. Job is a good one. Let's check our camera angle. Now we'll have a background to our render. A very, very large background to our render as it happens. So we can minimize that a bit. Click back to object mode, hit 3 to smooth it, and now we have some smoothing on there as well. Problem is, this is now going to interfere with our lighting. Now, it doesn't matter that it's passing through this sphere. This sphere isn't really going to change if we scale it up, it's fine. What it does matter is that when this light shines down here, this is going to cast a shadow on our objects, and we don't want that. So there is a way to control what casts shadows and receives shadows. If you click on the shapes that you don't want to do one of those things, in our case this polyplane, and go down to render stats, we can change this. In fact, let's do a render and see what difference that makes, because we can turn off the cast shadows. In fact, let's do that. This is a flat floor plane. It's not going to cast any shadows. We don't want the backing part of it interfering with our lighting. So let's bring up the Arnold render view again and see if we've managed to get rid of that nasty crossbar. You'll notice the next time we do this, it's quite a bit faster. Okay, so yeah, that looks perfectly adequate to me. We've got rid of that black in the background, and because it's smoothed, because it's like a smooth curve, you're obviously going to get the light catching it a bit differently, which gives you a pretty nice background image. And as you can see, once this has done its first render, it does get a bit faster. And again, I would say, I think I've mentioned before, that because of the recording software I've got going on here, this is a lot more sluggish than it might otherwise be. So hopefully for you guys at home, if you're, as you can see, I just got absolutely quite difficult to move this about with the recording software and this going at the same time. Let's just pause that. Let's come up here, get an angle I'm happy with. If your camera starts moving around in massive sweeping movements, pick something to focus on, hit F, and now when I move about, as you can see, it's much more focused to the scene that I actually want to render. So let's get a few more bricks in the background there, a little bit of zoom. In fact, I might actually move one of these piles of bricks. Easy enough to do. Let's go to the outliner. Okay, and brick pile 01, and let's just move it because we can. There we go. I like that more. Again, horses for courses. You can use my brick piles, you can use your own cars, you can space it differently than this. It's not really the issue. We're just looking for something that we like. So here, this will be fine. Okay, let's get a render. Okay, now a look at this. I think the light should be coming from the other direction. This is why we have to test render when we've got scenes like this. So let's make sure we have this render view bookmark. We do, and we can just zoom out a bit and take a look at the position of this light. So I'm going to shove it round to the front of the cars more. And now I can't see it. There it is. So that would be about there, I'm thinking. Yeah, let's have that a bit more on the front of the cars. And again, you can use your bookmark to go back to where you were. Pop your render view open, and you can change the exposure here if you're, not producing enough light in the scene. You don't have to keep cranking up the intensity. You can just tweak it here a little bit for testing purposes. And if we wanted to save this image, we can do that. Click this little save button here, and now we've got a saved image. We can render again and see what difference, if any, that makes to us. So this has given us a very kind of funky overall ambient lighting condition. And if I go back to the other one, so there's the difference, really. Okay, so at a normal brightness level, let's bring this down to 0. You're looking at this, and this is just a very low level of overall illumination. Now, let's create a better lighting scenario. So let's come in, I'm going to turn this off, and I'm going to create, now a couple of ways to do this. We could use a directional light to just put a large sort of infinite, like these things were out in the sunlight. We could use a point light to shine a light bulb over them. In this case I'm going to use an area light, so Arnold lights area light. I'm going to move this guy out, I'm going to move him over here. Now this for us can be useful to go back to our lighting use all lights, just so we can see in the direction that this thing is pointed. Now it's backwards, so I'm going to rotate it 180. There we go. And it's not having a large effect on our viewport here. So if we crank the intensity up to 25, this should at least give us an idea of where this light is going to go. Now again, this will affect the shadows when I move it up and down if it's not on normalize. So I don't think you can see normalize in the viewport. You can't. So again, this is a job for test rendering. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to pop the render view, I'm going to hit go, and we're going to see what this puppy does. Now let's turn off normalize, because I want the light to be affected by the volume of itself, if that makes sense. So we want to be able to scale this and have that affect the light intensity. So this and the HDR are acting as our main key lights right now. So the HDR will be more of a fill light, and this will be more of a key light. So now we can see that's got a good bit of intensity on it, and a nice bit of drop off into the background. Let's go in and get that camera view that we need. I'm just going to attempt to pull this window up so we can see it a little better. And yeah, that's looking pretty good. So I've got a very, very bright point of light on this car here. This one is less so. These Lego bricks in the background have less illumination. What we're trying to create here is an interesting lighting setup. The worst thing in the world is to get a directional light, point it down, everything is lit up, but it's boring. It doesn't look realistic at all. You want some bright spots, you want some shadowy spots. You want quite a lot of these things. Now, for me, this is enough light to get on with some materials. Now, we might need to create some rim lights in the back to highlight the edges of this. We might need to change the position of this area light. We might need to put another area light acting as a fill light coming in from the side, so we can get sort of much more light on this car than this one. We might need more pronounced shadows. There's lots of things that we might need to do with the light, and as I said in a previous part, this is always a balance. You need a lighting system that you're happy with, that you're going to use in the final shot. It doesn't have to be the final lighting system, it just has to be a little bit close before you start the materials. But again, you can't finalize the lighting until you have some materials. So it's a bit of a catch-22. So the way I like to deal with it is get some basic lighting up and running. In this case, one area light, one high dynamic range dome light. and then start on some basic materials and tweak as necessary. It's a very nice way of doing it. It gives you some flexibility later on when you need to change some things and you haven't spent 3 hours setting up 5 or 6 lights, tweaking them, getting them exactly in place, only to find out, well, when the materials are there, the lights are in the wrong place, the specular highlights are not right, you're not getting what you need. So I like to do it this way. Basic lighting, basic materials, retweak the lighting, then go back to the materials and make any tweaks that might be necessary. So I hope you've enjoyed this part. We've got our main scene now a little bit lit. When we come back, we'll look at putting some basic materials on it. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next part. Hi, welcome back. So in the last part we left off with our basic lighting system here, consisting of one area light with normalized turned off and one sky dome using a HDR studio lighting image. You could use a different HDR for this, it's entirely up to you. Give a few a try would be my advice and see which works best with your particular scene. In this case this one works quite well with this sort of softly lit Lego that we're going for. Now I would also say that in between these parts I haven't made any tweaks. I have made one small adjustment, which was to turn the intensity from 0.2 to 0.4, just to give us a little bit more light to work with while we continue with some materials. Now once I've got, as I mentioned in the last part, the basic lights set up, I like to start to throw materials on things and see how they look in the basic lighting system. So we will, throughout the course of this material, be using Arnold, of course, and we'll be using the Arnold standard material. Now this material is a bit like the architectural material in Mental Ray. It's a bit of a jack of all trades. You can use it for most things. So I'm going to go ahead and right click here and assign new material. I'm just going to assign, go down to the Arnold shaders, an AI standard material. Now, once we play this, we're going to render this whole thing out again, and we don't want to be doing that every time. So we can, of course, render just a section of this image. So in order for us to do this kind of sectional rendering, all we have to do is hit Control Shift together and then drag a box around what it is we want to update in this view. Now that will continuously update this material every time we change it. For instance, if I make this a much darker grey, you can see it updates here. So this gives us a very nice real-time update preview. So let's just make a Lego red to start with. Now I actually have the real colors of Lego here in RGB values, so we're going to get these as close to actual Lego as we can, as we happen to have the numbers handy. But for right now we'll just look at a Lego red, because there's something I want to cover with color management here. With the color management turned on, which it is by default in 2012, which basically means the render engine, lighting and everything else is working in linear space, but we're seeing it in RGB, gamma corrected sRGB. So you can tell here 2.2 gamma. This render view by default is on 2.2 gamma. If we flick open the options here, you can see the view transform is 2.2 gamma. Now this is exactly what you want. Color management used to be fairly confusing. It used to be quite difficult to set up. It used to require a lot of additional nodes. Now it's color managed by default. So, I mean, that's a very, very much simpler way of dealing with it, because it should be color managed by default. Render engines, the lights and everything else, they work in linear, but we see in RGB. We need gamma corrected to see what the actual image is going to look like. For instance, in an old version of Maya, without color management, what I'd actually see in the render view would be this. So it looks extremely dark in the render view right now. And that was a problem back in the old days, because you would then crank up the intensity of your lights and this would throw off the lighting, it would throw off the realism of the scene. So this color correction is no bad thing. It is, however, going to lead us into a few problems later on when we try and get an exact color for this. because if I was to go to an RGB 255 and click red of 100, let's say, so it gives us this kind of darker red, and turn off the color management, you can see that this is the color. Now 100 RGB is actually this color. When the color management turns on, it changes that color, which is fine. Absolutely, if you're just looking for a color that's going to match your render view, this is no issue at all. If you're looking to put a specific RGB value in that you've got from the web, well, that value will probably already have been color corrected. Or it will be in a color corrected space. It probably won't be in a linear space. So what you'll have is a value that's been color corrected twice, and obviously that will lead to the wrong value. So we're going to have to do some work with the color management a bit later on, but for right now that's just something to bear in mind. So when you're in Maya, everything is color corrected now, as it should be. You used to have to go in, use some correction nodes and do some jiggery pokery with the render display, and it used to be much more difficult. Now it's color corrected by default. You're working in what used to be called a linear workflow. It's all done by default. Does lead to this problem, however, if you've got a color corrected RGB value, like if you look up the color of Lego bricks on the internet, for instance, and you get somebody's RGB value that they've measured off a photograph, well, that photograph has been color corrected, so the value they are measuring is a color corrected value. So if you put it in here and Maya color corrects it again, you're going to end up with the wrong color. But there are ways to combat that we'll look into. I've gone slightly off topic here, sorry about that. But I want to talk about the default material for a start. So we've got color, we've got weight. So that's the weight of the color on the object. Now the reason it's set at 0.7 is in order to create a physically accurate material, these weights combined, so the weight of the diffuse, the weight of the specular, the weight of reflection in some cases, shouldn't add up to more than 1. Now, of course, this being CG, you can cheat, but if you want to keep your material as physically accurate as possible, which is never a bad idea, because materials that are more physically accurate tend to look better for the mainstay. I mean, of course, there is those cases in CG where you really want to cheat, and that's absolutely fine. But that's the reason it's set at 0.7, because if it was set at 1 and we came here and added some specular highlight to this, what would happen is we would then add up to more than 1 and we would have a non-physically accurate material. So if we set the weight of this to 0.25 for specular color, you'll see it update in the display. Now you've seen the whole thing go very light and kind of wishy-washy. This is because the roughness of that specular is very rough. So as we turn this down, we'll come to a much sharper highlight point. Okay, so it gets much sharper and it will look much shinier. You know, the lower the roughness is, the shinier you're going to be. So something like glass or a mirror, chrome, would have no roughness. Or, I mean, personally, I don't like to use 0 roughness, but of 0.02 roughness, so almost none. So now we've got an almost mirror-like finish on this thing. So the roughness will basically dictate how your specular highlight spreads out across the surface. Now if we look at this, we've got a specular highlight that seems to be spreading out across the entire surface, which is not what we normally want. What we normally want is to use the Fresnel effect, which is that effect that if you look straight down at a pool of water, it's going to be completely clear. If you're looking at your swimming pool or somebody else's swimming pool, and you look straight down, you're going to be able to see straight through the water. Same thing in a bathtub. You look down, you can see the bottom of the bathtub. If you catch that water at a very glancing angle, however, it can look almost like a mirror surface, and this is the Fresnel effect. So we can of course use that to advantage in our own renders. So if I turn this on, you'll see all of the specular has disappeared. That's because we've got the reflectance at normal, which makes the Fresnel effect more noticeable the lower the value. So we're not actually catching a lot of this at perfect glancing angles, but we don't need to be. We don't need to use this at a value of normal. We can of course turn it up, and lower values would represent something like metal that have very, very sharp, crisp edges, whereas higher values will allow less of the Fresnel effect, if you like. So depending on what you're going for, the combination of roughness to scatter the specular across the surface and the reflectance at normal, so at 100% you basically got 0 Fresnel effect at 1. And at 0 you've got the full Fresnel effect. So anywhere in between, as I say, metals are normally quite low, plastics can be quite high. You know, you can use this view to really dial in what it is that you're looking for here. Now you can also turn up the weight of your specular. So if we went to 0.6 for instance, you see I get a lot more specular refraction here, as you would expect really. So we'll leave a value of around 0.3 for now. You know, and I'm going to say that this is fairly plasticky looking. You know, as a base material this is not bad. Now we could add some reflection to this, but it's really not necessary. In the case of this plastic in a studio lighting setup, there would only be the lights for it to reflect. You would set this up for a kind of product shot way where you are only actually reflecting the light, and that's a specular reflection, so we don't actually need a physical reflection of the environment. If we did, we could go ahead and turn that on by giving it some weight. So let's just say 0.5 for the sake of argument, and you can see our Lego is now reflecting both the Lego around it, as you can see. So do we need reflection? No, in this case we really don't. Lego is reflective, but more to the point where it's only reflecting very bright objects, so we're reflecting the light sources around it. I mean, you can't see your face in it, but if you hold it up you can catch the light on it, and that would be a specular reflection as opposed to a normal reflection. Okay, as to what else we can change within our specular, this value will act as a kind of value that you would use for brush metal or a CD, and this will rotate the action of that. So for us this is not necessary. This will give you two choices of the kind of specular highlight that Arnold is capable of. For me, I just leave it on the standard one most of the time. Will do the job. So let's have a look at what else we've got in here. Now we've got some bump mapping that we're not going to be using, but if you are, there you are. Emission will cause this to actually emit light. So if we set the emission to red, let's say, and the scale up here, you'll see it causes it to actually emit light, and you can see little red highlights there. This is rather like a mesh light, although a mesh light is much better at this type of job. If you want some glowing surface that doesn't give out a lot of color, well, emission is your man. A bit somewhat akin to ambient color. Yeah, there we go. I knew that would pop up sooner or later in my tiny mind. Yeah, somewhat similar to ambient color on some of the Maya standard shaders. So now we have caustics, which we're not going to be using because, you know, we're not having any caustic patterns generated from light. We're not underwater. So refraction we'll be talking about when we make translucent plastic. That's where we have transmittance and opacity and weight of that. Of course, in this case, this is not translucent. So if we scroll down, there are some other things we can look at. Subsurface scattering. Now plastic can have an element of subsurface scattering. If it's thin plastic and you hold it up to the light, you know, areas will get brighter, light will scatter through the surface. So for us, should we add some? Well, we can add a small amount. So let's turn the weight of the subsurface scattering to 0.1, and you can see the effect that's had with this grayness coming over it. And that's down to the color. So let's make this red, and because we'd expect this to be a lighter color as the light comes through it, let's make it a slightly lighter color. We're going to up the radius here and leave it at that. Basically that should do for a nice kind of base plasticky material. Now we've got that one problem where this color is not actually Lego red. So I'm going to go now and grab the Lego color chart I've got for Lego colors. Okay, so here we are. Here's a list of Lego colors. You can actually find this Lego color chart by simply typing Lego RGB color into Google, and this will be the first or second result. So I'm not going to redistribute this with the tutorial. It's somebody else's website, so really, but yeah, it's very easy to find on Google. So let's have a look at some of the problems we might experience here. So let's use this Lego red color, bright red, 196 in R, 40 in green, and 27 in blue. So let's try it. So 196, 40, and 27. Okay, and yeah, so this color here is a very kind of washed out red. It's not what we expected. It's certainly not that whoops, I hit the wrong thing there. It's certainly not this bright vibrant red. So what's going on here? Well, this comes back to, as I said, once again, it comes back to the color correction. When they got these Lego colors had been taken probably from a photograph of Lego. So you photograph the Lego, the photograph by default will be sRGB corrected, or certainly when you look at it on a computer monitor and select the color, you'll select an sRGB corrected color. Now Maya is expecting a linear color in here. If we turn off the color management, you can see that that color is actually the color it should be. That's Lego red. But the color management is on. It's turned on in the viewer, it's turned on for the scene as a whole, so we could fix this issue by turning the color management off. But that would leave us another issue, because then our render would no longer look like this, it would look like this. And you can see there's that vibrant red, but now all our lighting is just gone. So how to fix this? Now, as I say, normally this wouldn't be a problem. Normally you would just be picking a nice red, and indeed you can do that if you don't want to be completely accurate to Lego colors. But what if you've got an already corrected value off the internet? Like you would have maybe, or you've taken a picture of Lego yourself and you've moved that into Photoshop and you've sampled the color. Well, you'll probably be working with an already corrected Lego color. So this becomes quite tricky. Do you turn the color management off? No. Basically is the answer to that. Do not turn the color management off. If you do, then the lights won't work. And I don't just mean the lights won't work because it will be a bit darker so you can turn the intensity up. That won't work either. You'll certainly be able to light the scene that way, but it will never be accurate lighting. So how do we fix this rather limp-wristed red? Well, again, you could go in and fix it by eye, make it a bit redder. We want actual Lego colors though, so let's do that. I'm going to turn this off for a second and I'm going to go into the hypershade. So Windows, Rendering Editors, Hypershade, and this is where you can tweak your materials, make connections to other nodes and things like this. This will give us this render ball here of our Lego red, which we can actually see if we expand it out a bit in 2.2 gamma, color corrected basically, or raw. So there's the Lego red we want, but that would mean turning off the color correction, which is something we really don't want to do. So I'm going to take this AI standard material here for a start, and I'm going to rename it to Lego red, and I'm going to just put AI at the end there so I know it's an Arnold material. Now we don't want to change this, so how do we combat this? I'm going to click here on the Lego red AI material and then click here to graph it. Now you can see here that this material has a color going out to a shading group, which is where we would put things like displacement shaders and whatnot, and we don't really need to worry about that so much right now. What we need is a gamma correction node. Now any of you that are used to using older versions of Maya, Mental Ray, this will be something you've dealt with time and time again. So it's not really that complicated. We're just going to come here and search for gamma and select everything. There you go, gamma correct. So we now have a gamma correction node. So we need to use this to remove the gamma from this so it's not color corrected twice. And I must state this is only necessary if you have a color value from an sRGB image that's already been corrected. There are other ways of doing this as well, kind of old school in this regard, but this way works. It works well, and it's fairly quick. So we're going to take this gamma correction node and middle mouse drag it onto the color. That's connected it to the color here. As you can see, the out value of the gamma correct is connected to the color. The gamma on this, if we left it at 1, it would simply be, well, I'll show you. Let's use our same Lego red. There it is, 196, 40, 27. And as you can see, this gamma node has done nothing for us because the gamma is set at 1. Now, generally, you would use one of these to gamma correct, but we don't want to. We want to un-gamma correct. So what we're doing here is we're taking the gamma off the value of that RGB image because Maya's going to correct it for us. So 0.454 in here, 0.454 in here, and 0.454 in here, which will remove the gamma correction from this value that we added. And as you can see, we now have this color. Maya still thinks it's color correcting it. We know it's not. It doesn't really matter if you have that ticked or not. It's just for your viewing. So when you're trying to do this by eye, you're seeing the right color. For us, though, this is the right color. So we can close that down a second. We can go back to Arnold. I'm going to take a screenshot of this rather weak red that we had, and I'm going to hit play here, and now we have exactly Lego red. That's Lego red. Now, of course, that's going to depend on how much light it's hitting it, exactly how red it looks, but that's the color Lego stipulate for red. And to get there, because Lego are going to give us a color in RGB, basically in sRGB, in gamma corrected RGB, not in a raw linear value for the color, we need to remove the color correction from it. So I hope that made sense. When we come back, we will look at getting some other materials on this and doing some clear plastics, maybe doing some rubber for the tires. So, you know, I hope you join me for that part, and I hope this part has been somewhat interesting to you. Thank you very much for watching. Hi, welcome back. So in the previous part we looked at getting our Lego red here, and with a proper corrected value for the numbers we downloaded off the internet for it. Now in this part I want to discuss clear plastics and things like that, but before we go into that, I want to get some other Lego colors on the go here. So I'm going to pop open the Hypershade here, so Render in Editor's Hypershade, and I don't want to have to recreate this Lego red color every time I come to do this. So, you know, I don't want to be constantly adjusting specular values, adding that subsurface scattering that we added, and doing all the business. I want to just use this one as a base template, and there's an easy way to do this. We can select this and just go to Edit, Duplicate, Shading Network, and that gives us another Lego red. So if we graph that down there, you can see it brings the gamma node in as expected. So it duplicates the entire shading network. So let's come here, and if we wanted another Lego color, let's pop open our little Lego color chart, and let's go for, say, dark green. So 40, 127, 70. So we know to put in here, make sure you're under RGB 0 to 255, 40, 127, 70, I think it was. Okay, and that gives us our Lego red. Let's just double check those values. So, sorry, our Lego dark green. 40, 127, 70. That's what we had. Yep, 40, 127, 70. Now, that gives us Lego dark green. So let's call it that. Lego dark green AI. I always add a prefix at the end to let me know what shader I'm dealing with at a glance. This can be helpful. So, you know, oh, we renamed the wrong one, as you can see there. Now, again, that's another issue. Some of the more eagle-eyed of you might have noticed last time that when I put the gamma correction node on, my color went from red, which it was, let's just put the red on it, to white. Let's see here, why can't I put that red on? There we go. It went from red to white. Now I think that's a fault with my graphics card. It sometimes happens. Normally I just have to switch the render into legacy view and then back into viewport 2 and all the colors pop back. Failing that, a restart of Maya will do it. So we can continue to duplicate these to get different Lego colors. Now there is one other value that will need to be changed. Because we have subsurface scattering, if we come down to the SSS component, that will still be red. So we're going to turn that to a nice green to update our Lego color, and we can do that here. Assign existing material, Lego dark green, and there we go. If I render this now, which I will do for you, you'll be able to see the difference. So let's just bring up the render view and I'll be back when it's finished rendering. Okay, so that's a fairly fast render right now. 32 seconds for the whole scene, which is not too bad. There is a lot of geometry in this scene with all these Lego bricks, so you know, considering we're doing some specular reflections here and we are rendering at, well, a fairly small size. Actually I have this one turned up to be HD, that would be 520 I think. So 32 seconds, perfectly acceptable to me. And that was to render the whole scene, not just this little bonnet portion. So that's how you would duplicate Lego brick materials, because we're going to need quite a few of them for these guys in the back. Now I'm not going to make you sit there and watch me go through the hypershade while we, you know, duplicate 26 different Lego colors, because I think it's entirely redundant. I think you guys can just go through using the Lego color chart and get whatever color plastic Lego you want right now. Now I want to move on to something a little more complicated, so let's Control Shift and surround these guys here, because we're going to deal now with refractive objects. So things would be glass, plastic bottles, water, anything that is refractive. So you know, your standard pane of window glass would have, say, an index of refraction of 1, and we'll show you what that does in a second, and a glass bowl or a glass ball would have an index of refraction of 1.6 or something like this. You can find index of refraction numbers on Google, just look up IOR numbers. But before we get into that, let's have a look at what Arnold requires. Let's stop this so it's not constantly in the background. What Arnold requires for you to make something opaque. Now you see, if I click on this Lego brick, and under its shape node, if I open Arnold, which won't be open by default, you'll see it's ticked as opaque. Now everything in Arnold is ticked as opaque. The render engine gets a significant speed boost by just assuming that nothing is going to be transparent in any way, shape or form. Nothing is going to be refractive. Now in most render engines what happens is it will assume everything could be refractive unless you tell it it's not. But Arnold, you know, for case of speed, it's just going to assume that the surface is entirely opaque. So if I was to come in here and assign a shader now with refraction on, it wouldn't work, because Arnold would just ignore it, because it says here the surface is opaque. So if we look at these bricks, you'll see opaque has been ticked off. That's because I've literally come in and ticked it off. So every brick in your scene, you need to come in and make sure opaque is off. Now I've done this, I must have done it in a previous part when I was rendering this for some tests, but all of these bricks here will be clear Lego bricks. So we must make sure, or it won't work, that opaque here under the shape node under Arnold is switched off. So let's go back to the render view. That won't actually do anything because we haven't told it to be opaque. It's not going to be, regardless of this tick switch or not. So let's put a material on this that could be opaque. So let's go to assign new material, and we're going to put a clear plastic Lego on this. So once again, AI standard shader, as I mentioned before, it's very similar to the mental array ArcViz material in the manner in which it's a bit of a jack of all trades. It can do a bit of everything. You know, it can become transparent, translucent, it can have subsurface scattering on it. You know, so it's the base material in Arnold. It's what you'll be using most of the time. Now, if we want to make something completely clear, we want no diffuse contribution to it. We want light to shine through it. We don't want it to be a diffuse surface. So let's turn the weight of this down to 0. But now we have a material with 0 weight at all. So we need to turn the specular contribution up to 1. Well, we don't need to, but in this case it's going to be a very shiny surface. So now we're still at a weight of 1. We're still good. Roughness. Now, a glass surface is not necessarily going to be very rough. You know, it might have a few scratches and dings on it that make it look a bit rough, but it's going to have very sharp specular highlights. Let's turn this down to 0.05. Let's turn on Fresnel. Again, we don't need to worry about the values here because we're not doing something like a CD or a brushed metal aluminium surface. And let's go down to refraction. Now the weight of refraction is going to be 1. The IOR of refraction, because this is transparent plastic, which is not completely see-through. If it was a sheet of transparent perspex, a perfectly flat sheet, then sure, it'd be like looking through a pane of glass. But this object has shape to it. So it's going to have an IOR of about 1.3, 1.4. This will determine how the light bends through it. And as I mentioned, you can go on to Google and download a index of refraction list for various different materials, whether they be diamond, glass, you know, whatever would be refractive. So, just a couple of things we need to change. We won't need any roughness. Transmittance will affect the color of the light passing through the object. So if you wanted a colored plastic, you could use this. It would also affect how much light passes through. So, you know, if you put it sort of halfway, only half the rays of light would get through. If you change the color, it would also change the color of the plastic. It's better to change it here than it is to change it here. In fact, we're going to just a little bit down on transmittance because I'm going to say my Lego brick's a bit scuffed up. It's not exactly crystal clear, so just a little bit down on that. Fresnel uses IOR. So that will give us more realism to it, and I'm going to come in and I must have left the render view going here. Yeah, it looks like I did, so I'm going to stop that. I am going to add these bricks to that material. So let's just select all the bricks we need to be clear here and assign existing material. And we have AI standard 4. Well, that's hardly very descriptive, is it? Let's come up here and call it Lego Clear Plastic AI. I thought I'd done that, but obviously I'd forgotten. And camera view 15. Let's go back here and render, and we're going to hit an issue. But it's not one that's too difficult to deal with. And it brings us succinctly onto a new point where we can discuss the quality settings within Arnold. Now you'll notice this is taking quite a bit longer to render than it did before, because of all the, it has to calculate all the rays of refraction through it, so it's going to be slower. But you'll notice a lot of blackness here, and it seems to be happening on the inside of our Lego brick, and this is because by default there will only be a certain number of refraction rays traced through an object. So if you had an object that was a single plane of thickness and one refraction ray, that ray would go through it quite easily. If you have a Lego brick which has, say, one wall and then another wall and then another wall and another one, because of how it's structured. So if we just stop this and take a look at a Lego brick here, let's just grab one of these standard bricks. You'll do. There we go. So if we look at this, if a refraction ray is going to pass through this, it's got to pass through this, then it's got to pass through this, then it might have to pass through this and this. So we're going to need 4 levels of refraction, but it might have to 1, 2, it might have to pass through this, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it might have to pass through indeed 8 pieces of geometry, or 8 sides. It might have to penetrate 8 times before it clears the back of the object, and that's what this blackness is. The ray has gone through, it's gone to its maximum depth, so it's just given up the ghost and gone, well, okay, you're black then. That's it, I can't get through any further. And lots of the rays in Arnold are determined by this. So if we pop open the quality settings and look at the ray depth, you can see we have different rays for different things. Now reflection will be how many reflections you can have. So if you had 2 mirrors side by side, you know, one of those infinite reflection things. In this case you only get 2 reflections. So if you need more reflectivity, you need to increase the number of reflections. If you need more refraction, you need to increase the number of refraction rays, or the depth the depth the refraction ray can travel. Now, diffuse is a little different. It's a number of times the light diffuse rays will actually bounce. So higher diffuse levels will cause more bounce light in your scene. The problem with all of these things is that they're all going to massively increase render time. Having twice as many diffuse rays can often double render time. Now, Arnold is pretty quick at refraction, so if we change these up to, let's just do it incrementally. So let's change it to 3 and get a snapshot. There we go. So that should have given me a snapshot, and I believe it has. Yep. So snapshot 2, there we go, and click off it to get off it. So let's just increase this to 3. Get a render and see if some of that blackness goes away. Now we know we need more penetration than this, but the name of the game here is to get just what you need. Don't just crank it up to 25. That'll solve all my problems. Yes, it will. And then you'll have to go on holiday while you wait for your picture to render. So again, let's try this incrementally. Okay, so it's quite difficult to tell, but it appears to have got rid of some of it. Yep, if we click backwards and forwards, you can see a lot of that blackness disappears as the rays are able to penetrate further into the surface of our clear Lego bricks. So what if we use 4? Okay, kind of close, but still no cigar. 5. Okay, so very nearly now. 6, and Lego bricks are not really the best thing. They're actually quite a complicated refractive surface because they interlock together. They have wall thickness, then they have little knobs on the top that interlock with other little knobs. So actually getting good refraction through Lego is actually quite tricky. So there we are at 6. Let's do a screen grab here. So this little button to do a screenshot, and let's do it with, let's say, 8 and see if we can notice any difference. So 6, 7, 8. I'm going to jump to 8. Remember, we want to keep render time as low as possible. With 8 refraction rays here, let's just click off the screenshot and you'll see this will be really quite slow. So while we might need 8, can we actually see the difference by eye? Is it going to make a huge difference to us? Let's have a look. So let's see the screenshot. And this, yeah, it's making a little bit of difference, and the render time is a 1 second increase. So I'm going to leave it 8 for now. I might turn that down. If it becomes a bit slow on the overall render, we might turn it down. But that is basically our clear plastic. I'll just wait for this to render out, because what I did there was click Control-Shift together and clicked on the image. It's habit, and that goes back to rendering the entire picture. So I won't make you sit through that. I'll be back in a second when we'll make some colored plastic for these little, what would be flashing lights on the top of our tow truck here. Okay, so that finished out. I'm actually going to stop this so it doesn't continue in the background, and that's basically our transparent clear plastic. Now obviously this is just the first brush of the material. You might end up, completely happy with this. You might end up not happy at all. It really depends on what extra lighting you might put in. For me, this is good. So I'm just going to check. Roughness looks okay. Fresnel looks okay. You can change the microfract distribution. Beckman, this one will have slightly broader specular highlights in my experience, so you might want that. Just going to check the weight of refraction is 1. The index of refraction is 1.3. That might need a little tweaking. Our transmittance is not completely clear. Our opacity, we don't have any. Exit color we don't need. So this looks all pretty decent for a clear plastic. So let's come in and duplicate this, because we can obviously use a clear plastic as a base material for a red clear plastic. So window, let's go to rendering, editor, hypershade. And I'm going to turn this material viewer off, because it causes my particular graphics card to go into meltdown, which is normally fine. It's just the fans get a little noisy on the video. So let's go to Lego Clear, and we can assume that's Lego Clear Plastic. So edit, duplicate, shading network. So Lego Clear Plastic AL, and let's call this Lego Clear Plastic Red. And just knock the 1 off there. There we go. Now we can start to play with this. So graph it down there, and as you can expect, it's just the material. There's no color correction going on with these clear plastics. I'm just taking the value from what looks good, and obviously white is going to be white. So for us, right, okay, so now we've got that Lego Clear Plastic Red. Let's come and make sure these are ticked on opaque, and I've done them earlier, but they will be ticked opaque by default, so I apologize for that. I should have come in and reset those back to default. Just slipped my mind. Anyway, so let's assign a material to these things. So assign existing material and a Lego Clear Plastic Red AL. Okay, and you'll notice that these have become white. Now again, I think this is an issue I'm having here with the graphics card or the graphics card drivers I'm using, because they should be black, because the diffuse color on them is weight of 0. Now the same thing happened when I first assigned the red to this, and you should see now that it is working. It comes in as red, not white. I think that's purely an issue I'm having Maya acting up on me a bit, or not liking the particular graphics card drivers I'm using. Alright, but let's go into our render view, so Arnold render view, and let's just surround these top lights here. And again, Control Shift and drag, and let's make the transmission of these. Really all we should need to do is make the refraction transmittance. We'll make it red. Okay, I'm not going to shoot for any particular color right now. Just going to make sure that this does indeed give me a clear plastic, and it does. Very, very nice clear plastic. So, well, a clear red plastic, of course. So you can come in then, and from there tweak the color. I think the Lego one's a little more orangey. I'm not going to get an exact color for these because it's not necessary, and I'm not even sure my Lego color chart has the clear plastic colors, to be honest, but they're very kind of orange or yellow or red, so you know, quite simple. So realistically, for materials, you're going to use the AI standard material for most things. Now, if you're rendering something like hair or some very complicated subsurface scattering like skin, then you might use different materials. But for most things, your metals, your plastics, your glass, your wood, your stone, for pretty much all of those things, you're going to end up using the AI standard material. So go through it, get used to it. It's a very, very large part of Arnold. Backlighting we didn't cover, basically translucency to a certain extent. We're not going to be using translucency here, we're using full-on clear plastic, but if you wanted to do something like a translucent piece of paper, look into backlighting. I think we've covered quite a bit of this material. We haven't delved into some of the more advanced settings, but this tried to keep this tutorial about as fundamental as possible. So we're going to come back and look at some Arnold quality settings, look at tweaking our lights, look at tweaking our materials, because these materials are really only a first blush. A lot of the time you get them simple, they work. Arnold's very good at that, and you don't need to change them. Sometimes you come in when they're all together. When you've put all colored bricks on this, it will change the way the light bounces around. It will change certain look of this thing. So, you got to be quite careful to not spend too much time trying to finalize all your lighting or finalize all your materials before it's time. So you want a base level of lighting, a base level of materials. You want to then come in, crank them both together, have a look what they look like, and do your adjustments from there, if any. Sometimes, you just get it right. It's a simple scene like this. It's not particularly complicated to render, so we shouldn't have to do too much tweaking. Right, I'll let you go, and in between these parts, I'm actually going to assign a color to all of these bricks. And I'm going to do that using the materials we've already got. I'm going to duplicate, and I'm going to just assign a different color value from my little Lego color chart. So when we come back, we'll have a bit of color on everything, again just by duplicating this AI standard material with the different Lego colors. We will look at creating a rubber tire. It requires a broader specular highlight, but that's about it. But I'll cover it in the next part. And then we'll look at quality, tweaking, and some various other things. Might have to change the light a little bit, might have to introduce some more fill lights. We'll look at it when we come back. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next part. Hi, welcome back. So I've gone ahead in between the parts and just coloured in the Lego bricks. I've literally just clicked the material, assigned to selection, and you'll see I made a few extra colours. I made bright yellow, bright violet, bright blue, and bright orange and green. So exactly the same way we did before, into the hypershade, duplicate, simply change the colours. That's it. Nothing to it, really. Now, this render's looking pretty good. We got those tyres to do, but I said I'd build that material on camera because it will be ever so slightly different than the ones we've got, because it will be rubber. Other than that, I'm pretty happy with the way this is turning out. Now, it's very grainy, of course. We have quality issues. You can see the grain in the spec. You know, we'll clean all this up at the end. What you don't want is at this point to massively increase quality, only to find out you need to come and maybe put another light in, which we'll probably do here. You want to keep everything nice and quick for your test renders. So I'm going to kind of make this window a bit minimalistic. It's stopped at the moment, so it's not going to be doing anything. So in fact, I think I'll just shove it off screen there, and we can go and make this rubber. So assign new material, and again, I'm just going to use the AI standard material. There we go. Oops, my render view actually was not turned off, my IPR render, the Arnold render view. So now it's started rendering on my other screen. Right, now I've shut it off. Sorry, as I previously mentioned, that together with the recording of the high-def video I'm doing at the moment really bogs my system down, so you should have a better experience with it. But anyway, here's our material, AI Standard 6. Let's call this Lego Rubber Black AI. And of course, let's go up and give it a diffuse color of black. Now, I don't like to use 100% black. It's never a great idea, so I'm just gonna make this. In fact, let's go to the hue, saturation, and value. And actually, that's not going to do it, is it? No, it's not. So yeah, we'll just give this a nominal value, 3, 3, and 3, just so we're not at 100% black. Okay, now this is going to be a rubber tyre, so really the only difference from that and plastic is that this won't have a rough specular highlight on it. It'll have a very broad specular highlight on it, and it will probably have slightly less of the Fresnel effect. So let's crank that up to about 0.4 maybe, because rubber would have a flat broad specular highlight. And that's it, that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to do no subsurface scattering for the rubber. There's no need really. You know, this should be about fine. So I just wanted to wait so you could see that it was indeed a very simple material to do. And I've also got a material for the floor, which is exceedingly simple. It's just a white AI standard material, that's it. No other changes, no specular, no nothing. Just a white material, just to give us something to render on. So there we go. Let's assign material to these, and Lego black rubber, and do the same for the other tires here. Okay, so that pretty much materials everything. You can see the different color Lego bricks we have there in the background. You know, feel free to change them, feel free to use different Lego colors, and no need to make the cars this exact color either. I don't really think you can tell a person what color they should have their Lego, but this is the color the cars were on the little box that I bought when I started this basic modeling tutorial, and I'm continuing through now with this basics of rendering. So I just use the colors on the box, but of course, you know, feel free to change them. Actually, these, I remember now, were black. So Lego black, where have you gone? There we are, Lego black there. Done. So let's have a look at our render, and one thing I would like to change, there's not enough specularity for me on the edge highlights. So if I was photographing something now, I might bounce some light off a big reflection card and then have that pick up the edges. Now that would be good. We could do that in Maya, but that's bouncing an awful lot of light around, and that's also, a lot of ways for the light to travel. Render time would increase, but we can bring in a kind of cheat light. Let's just bring in a Arnold lights area light. So the same as this one, basically, but we're going to use it in a slightly different way. So this time, let's bring it out here. Let's rotate it round, and I'm going to make it quite a bit bigger. It's actually pointed away from everything, as you can see there by the little tail on the front. So let's turn it round towards the car here. Let's get it sort of top down, so it can really be used to catch the highlights along here. Let's move it out this way, because we want it coming from sort of the same angle as the front one. Well, in this case it's not going to matter that much, it's going to be used more of a reflection card. So let's make it quite a bit bigger, and I'm going to move it up and bend it over a tad. There we go. So something like this. Now when I'm going to be rendering this, let's have a look, my test render. Let's get it from the same angle, and I already know that I don't want this thing to put out a lot of light, so we definitely want normalize on. Okay, because we don't want this to kick out a lot of diffuse light. Although what will probably happen is, let's capture a render first. Instead of listening to me, we can just see what it does, and it probably won't do a lot because the intensity is rather low. Okay, I can already see that that's not doing a lot, so let's pause it and go in, and I think we had the other one, we used intensity this time just for the sake of being different. Let's use exposure. Okay, I'm not seeing a big contribution from that, so let's use slightly more exposure. Come on, 8, let's say, and give my system a second to catch up. In fact, what I'll do is I'll pause this. I'll just find a good level of exposure I'm happy with, because the recording and trying to render at the same time on this system is not the best, it must be said. So let me just pause this. Oh, there we go. Now it's kicked in. Right. Alright, so I'll pause the video and I'll just experiment with this exposure a little. Okay, I found an exposure I was happy with, turned out to be 12. Now, the problem is we've got a bunch of light kicked into the scene here. So this is what I didn't want. I'm really trying to just catch a little bit of speck around the top of these things, and a little bit here, and a little bit here, and a little bit more here. I'm just trying to highlight that specularity. So I'm going to go up to the light and hit emit diffuse. And that's going to stop it emit and diffuse. We'll still get that specular contribution, but it won't emit diffuse light into the scene. So in this case, it's going to act like a reflection card. Okay, so here's what that looks like when it's done. Here's the extra speck we got along here, along here, along here, along these tires, a little bit here most probably. And in order to see the contribution from that light with the diffuse turned off but the speck left on, I'm going to snapshot this. I'm going to turn the illuminates by default off, which will turn the light off, and then we'll be able to flick backwards and forwards and see exactly what contribution that light made to our scene. And I recommend you do this when you put a new light in. So I'm going to turn illuminates by default off, and that will re-render, and I'll be back in a second. Okay, so this is the one with the light turned off. Let's flick backwards and forwards. So you can see we get a significant specular contribution from that light. Might actually be too significant, but I quite like it. So at this point I would turn the light back on, dial back the exposure a little bit, and run these tests to see if I can get it at a place where I really like it. But I'm really liking the amount of extra speck light this puts on everything. You know, it gives, when this has more detail to it, this render, that'll give a lovely amount of specular light, I would have thought. I mean, look at our tires, they just come up a treat really on this side. You can see it's affecting things over here, it's definitely affecting this Lego brick pile behind us. Just gives a boost to that speck. Now, if we were using actual reflective materials that were reflecting the environment, then we could of course just put a big white card there, which would have a very similar effect. But this is only reflecting specularity. We are only doing a specular reflection, so this is only going to reflect light sources. it's a bit of a 3D cheat thing really, but we're only going to reflect light sources. So if I put a big white card there now, not a lot's going to happen. So I have to put a light source there, but because I have to put a light source there doesn't mean that light source has to emit diffuse. This is 3D, we can cheat. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to say that was probably a bit much exposure. I'm going to go with 11. I'm not going to run the tests again and waste everybody's time, but I would think that, oh, it's re-rendering in the background, so I'll just pause for a second. Okay, well, Arnold decided to re-render that because I forgot to stop it, so it looks like I am going to be able to run the comparison test. So this spec was with the exposure at 12, this with the exposure at 11. This gives me the spec boost I'm looking for. This is a little too much, really. That might actually come out looking quite nice. So, I'd probably make a note of this was a spec light with an exposure of 12 shot, just so when we get on to the better quality, I would know what to adjust it to without having to go through too many hoops. But an exposure of 11 seems to give me the specularity bump I was after. That nice, spec around here, here, bit more down here, bit more on the wheels, but not quite as much as that. So horses for courses, entirely depends on what your scene needs. So now our scene is lit by one basically fill light, which would in this case be acting as the HDR image, which kind of fills the whole scene with some form of light. And then we have one key light. In this scene we're not using a rim light to highlight from behind because it's not necessary. It's also often referred to as a hair light, which is if you're shooting a portrait, you can put a bright light behind somebody's head and it gives them that nice glow around the hair. So we're using at this point basically a fill light, a key light, which is this one, our main light, to highlight the front of this car, and we're using a big specular reflection card to get those specular reflections where we want them to be. Other than that, we are pretty much done with the lighting. I left that render turned on, didn't I? Yes, I did. Okay, I really must learn to pause this before I go whapping the camera around. Now, in terms of lighting for me, this is quite fine. It might look a bit dark to you on your screen, but this is a 32-bit image, so if I want to lighten it up, it's not that difficult without changing all the lights. It's not necessary. And I've said this, I've had this discussion with colleagues, the job of a modern render engine is to get information out of the software. What you're not trying to do is get your render to look perfect here. That's never going to happen. I see over and over again people get to this point, and obviously we have quality issues, but I'm talking more about the level of light, the level of specularity, the exact red of the brick. All of these things. People get to this point and then they spend another week tweaking, the specular value. They'll spend ages sliding the red slider backwards and forwards, looking for the precise color. They'll add a whole bunch of extra lights, adding to the render time, trying to get some more contrast between light and dark. They'll spend an awful lot of time doing stuff that these days is not necessary. The job of this render engine is to get the information out into a third-party program, whether that be Photoshop, Nuke, After Effects. In the case of a lot of the film industry, it's Nuke, of course. It's the one I use. I'm actually going to run the end of this tutorial through Photoshop because it's a very basic tutorial and I really don't want to get into Nuke right now. But that's the job of the render engine is done. Now we improve the quality, we slice this thing up into layers, and we import those layers in Photoshop, which is where we do our contrast correction, our color correction, our grading, and things like this. You do not use a render engine to do your color grading. You don't use a render engine to slightly tweak a contrast value, because all of this can be done in any of a number of post applications really quickly and easily. So when we come back, and this is a fundamentals course, and most people wouldn't include things like they used to be called render passes, now called AOVs, a way of slicing an image up into its diffuse contribution, its specular contribution, its SSS contribution, its indirect diffuse, and then stitching it back together. Most people wouldn't consider this a fundamental requirement for rendering. Personally, I would. You should start doing it this way. It will save you so much time in the long run, because as you see, we took some time going through the different lighting types in Maya, and then we took some time going through the AI standard material, which is the one you're basically going to be using all the time. But as to lighting the scene itself, as to placing the lights and deciding whether we're going to go and tinkering with their brightness, well, that hasn't taken very long at all, nor should it. You almost always, especially in a scene like this, do not need 35 different lights. It's just not necessary 99% of the time. And if you looked at the render for this tutorial on the promotion, that's pretty much what we're going to end up with. But we're going to go from this point to that point. So when we come back, we'll look at these render layers, AOVs in Arnold. We'll look at how to split this image, and we'll look at fixing these quality issues we've got. From there, we'll go into Photoshop, where I'll very briefly explain how to stitch the image back together in Photoshop and edit the individual layers of it. And that is what basically makes up rendering, especially in modern render engines. You're honestly looking to get information out the render engine in a 32-bit format to get it into something else. You are not looking to spend 3 weeks tinkering about in this view trying to get the exact shade of red or a little more contrast under here. I'll show you how to do that much more quickly, much easier. Alright, so sorry for rambling on, and thank you for watching this part. Join me in the next one where we'll solve these quality issues and take a look at those AOVs. So thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back. So we left off around here with this image, which has some very nasty quality issues with all this grain. One thing to be said though is this image is almost at 200% magnification here, so we're only actually rendering a very small image, which also means that when we blow it up like this, you're going to see much more artifacting than you would when we render out a high quality one. There will still be grain, which we'll address, but before we do that, I want to talk about splitting this image up into its individual components, so we will have far more control over it in Photoshop. We'll be able to tweak the level of specularity in Photoshop, we'll be able to tweak the diffuse colors in Photoshop, we'll be able to tweak the indirect illumination in Photoshop, or whichever package you use. In this case I'll be using Photoshop, but it will allow us huge flexibility over this image without having to sit here all day and render. So let's take a look at how we do that. Now, if we open up our render settings, you'll see it's got a tab here for AOV. These are Arnold's render passes. Basically, you might have heard them described as render passes if you've been using Mint or Ray, render layers even from older versions of Maya. But anyway, these will allow us, we can look at the different AOV groups, and these are for Arnold materials. Now, you're probably only going to have hair, shadow catcher, skin, and standard. These AL, cell, hair, layer, surface shaders are third-party shaders. So if you do a search for AL Arnold shaders on the internet, you'll find all of these shaders available for download for Arnold. They're all excellent. Go and get them. Have a play. Well worth looking into. But anyway, we've been using AI standard throughout because, Arnold doesn't have thousands of different shaders like Mental Array did or Maya. It just has a couple basically. So standard for pretty much everything, skin for skin, shadow catcher would be the same as Mental Array's use background shader or a close approximation of it, and AI hair, well, you guessed it, it's for rendering hair. So as you can see, standard is used for pretty much everything. We haven't used any of these skin or hair, so of course we only need to create AOV passes for this AI standard material. Now we want to split this up, I wouldn't say completely, but we want the direct diffuse, the direct specular, the indirect diffuse, the indirect specular. This gives us our direct and indirect diffuse, direct and indirect light contribution if you like, and our direct and indirect specular contribution. We have SSS in this scene, but it's not complicated SSS. In fact, I would guess that it's hardly on at all because of the uniformity of the light, and there's no strong light source shining through these bricks. So probably the SSS is going to look all pretty much one color. So rather than taking the indirect and direct and layering one on top of the other, we'll just take SSS, which is both of these together. And we have nothing that emits light. We have no emission geometry, so we don't need emissions. We have no reflections really, and we'll take that so you can see it. Refraction, refraction opacity we're not going to use in this case, and there's a whole bunch of options for this. This can get very complicated and very technical fairly quickly if you want to do things like splitting the image up into subsections, saving out masks for later use, stuff like that. All stuff I would cover in a much more advanced tutorial than this one. This one I just want to point out that doing this is quite simple. And you should be doing it. Regardless if you go on to make it more complicated than this, at a minimum you should be doing this. So let's close this down, and I'm going to hit render here, and this will allow me to see those AOV passes. Okay, so this has allowed me to render this. It took really no longer than it did before, so this is not adding 40 minutes to your render time. There really is no reason not to do it. And now if I go up here, you can see I can just isolate the direct diffuse contribution, the direct specular contribution, the indirect diffuse contribution, which is of course going to contain bounced light, the indirect specular, same again, it contains bounced light, the reflection, which should be black, which it is, because as I said we have no true reflections in this, which is why we couldn't just use a big white card up here. We have specular reflections, which basically look like this. We have refraction, and we have SSS, which will probably look, yep, pretty uniform in color. So in this case we probably could have skipped the SSS, it's not adding a lot to our render time, and we can probably tweak this in Photoshop to get a better subsurface scatter without going in and playing with a mind-boggling number of settings here in Arnold. So for me, that's split it up pretty well. There is one thing, however, I am missing, which is a depth pass. Photoshop contains some lens blur filters now which allow you to use a depth pass. So let's go and grab a depth pass, which we should be able to do here, which for the life of me I can't see. It's probably in the built-in groups. There it is. So Z depth basically. So we're going to activate a Z depth as well and re-render, and the Z depth on this, because of scale and other issues, is probably just going to look like it's white. But let's render it and see. And even if it does look like it's white, because it's 32 bits, we're going to be able to correct it so it's not. So we'll see in a second. Okay, so that really doesn't take a long time to render, 44 seconds in this case. So, you've added nothing to your render time once again. And let's check out that Z depth. Yep, as expected, it's white. If I can turn this down, maybe, no, that's too many, -25, too many, -10. There we go. So you can see the information is actually there. It will just require a bit of tweaking to get it to come out in Photoshop, which is absolutely fine. And when I said 32-bit images held a lot of data, well, I meant it. I mean, even though you can't see it, it is there. And the same goes for a lot of these other passes. So because you'll be saving out 32-bit images, it gives you a lot of scope to be able to tweak and work with. But all our other passes should remain as before. Indeed they do, and you see the floor seems to disappear in these direct specular shots and indirect specular. That's because there is no specular on the floor. I wanted a matte plain white floor. So okay, so now we've got all our information. So we've got our final render with lighting we're fairly happy with, or lighting we can work with. We've got our passes to throw to Photoshop, Nuke, or After Effects, and we've got our scene complete. We've got a shot we like. I quite like this angle. So now I've got to make the decision. This is the one I render. Now is the time to start to look at the quality on these lights. So we could go into the universal quality here under Arnold render, and we could give this a bit more anti-aliasing, and we could give it a bit more rays. Now we don't need more rays. We don't want to bounce more diffuse light around. We don't have any reflections to speak of, no real reflections. So turning any of this up at this point is not going to make much difference. So ray depth, we're done with it. Now this will make a difference. If we turn the diffuse up, or the camera AA in general, this will make a difference. It will also add hugely to render time. So it's generally better to tweak what it is that's causing the noise. So if we look at the direct diffuse pass here, the noise, yeah, it's a little noisy. Let's look at the indirect diffuse pass. That's much noisier than everything else. It normally is. So first things first, let's go grab our AA Sky Dome light. If you don't see this outliner, you can find it under Windows Outliner. So let's grab that. I've just got mine docked on the left here. I normally keep it there. It's very handy. And increase the number of samples. As we spoke about before, samples on lights will have a direct impact on their quality, so let's increase the samples to 3, and let's grab some area lights. And I've done that. I've left Arnold rendering again. I said in the last part I'd have to remember that. Of course I forgot. Okay, so Arnold's rendering with that quality of 3, and you can see a lot of the grain has already started to disappear. So I'm just going to pause this. Okay, sorry about that. I accidentally hit the pause button there while the render was coming through. So you can see we've already nixed a lot of the grain. It's gone. Now it's not completely perfect, of course, but it was that Sky Dome that was causing a lot of those grain issues. And we went from 44 seconds to 51 seconds. It's not actually that much of an increase. Now let's grab our area light and turn the samples a bit up to 3 and let it render. Okay, and that went up to 54 seconds. So we are starting to add some time to the render. I'm actually going to pause it this time and come in and set this one samples to 3. Now, because the area light is, the dome light is having the biggest impact, I'll probably set the sampling on this to 4. It might be a little too high, might increase the render time a little too much. And of course I could come in and globally adjust the camera anti-aliasing or the diffuse, because it's the diffuse where we're getting most of the problems. So if I turn that to 4, let's see what that does to our render time. So let's render. This might be too much quality, and there is such a thing as too much quality if it affects render time adversely. And there is nothing wrong with a little bit of grain in the shot. Generally, if I've done a render with a render engine that typically doesn't leave grain, like Mental Ray for instance, I'll then go into Photoshop and add grain afterwards. So you're not trying to get the perfectly smooth image, you're trying to get the amount of grain that actually gives it a touch of realism. Film has grain, so it's not the end of the world, especially for a still shot. So remember that if you're adding 4 hours to your render, it's probably not necessary in a lot of cases. Okay, so 1 minute 8 seconds, but this is a very, very small image. It is about, realistically, let's get it to the size it is about this size. In fact, that's exactly 1 to 1. So, it's very difficult on an image this size to tell if you've dealt with those quality issues. It's very difficult to see, if this is going to be a bit rough or that. So the next thing we need to do is, once we're basically happy, we haven't increased our render time exponentially. We've gone from about 45 seconds to 1 minute 8. We haven't gone from, 45 seconds to 25 minutes, which would be a disaster when we upscaled this thing. Now we need to start to look at this thing when it's a bit bigger, to really start to dial in any quality issues we might be having. Now this is fairly simple, so I don't think we're going to get that many, but let's have a look. So we'll go to View, Test Resolution, 100%. And I'm just going to press O, which should zoom us in. There we go, O on the keyboard to jump to full screen. So this is still HD 520. I don't want to go to a massive render just yet. Sorry, HD 540, not 520. I don't want to go to a massive render just yet. I want to check this out first. So back in a moment when it's finished. Okay, so at this bigger size, it took 4 minutes and 19 seconds, which is really not that bad. And in fact, this is actually not that bad. I would pass that off as fairly acceptable in terms of noise. you know, it could have a little more quality to it, but realistically, I mean, it could do with a little more anti-aliasing, but that's when you're going to really start to come in and hit a large render time, because that's going to push everything. So just for you, and because I forgot to turn this off again, I'll let this finish and we'll see if we get, you know, a longer render time than 4 minutes. I would think we would get a much longer render time. Okay, so here's the anti-aliasing set to 4 from 3, and it took 7.5 minutes. So we've almost, but not quite, doubled our effective render time by just changing that one setting. Was it worth it? Well, it looks ever so slightly crisper, but I would say it's quite minimal at this point. Whether you do this for a still shot, I probably would, because, you know, go and put the kettle on, still shot takes half an hour, it's not such of a worry. Would you do it for an animation? Probably not. If you're doing 200 frames, it depends what the animation's for, of course. If you're in a production environment, you should whack it on a render farm, but even then, you still want to keep that time down as low as possible. So, you know, you really need to be a bit careful with some of these values. Now, if we go through our passes here, our AOVs, and look at refraction, I still seem to be getting the odd black spot in here. Now, we know how to fix this. We can increase the number of refraction rays. Is that worth it? Again, it comes down to the individual shot. Is anyone going to look at this shot and go, oh, look, a black dot? Probably not, but you know what? Let's put this on pause, because we know it's an issue. Let's come in and get a ray depth, and you know, I don't think it's an issue. I'll go up to 9 maybe. And that's about as far as I'd push it, because this could actually be, this doesn't necessarily need to be a refraction issue. This could be this refracting the light down here, and we're seeing this tire or this back wing, so it couldn't even be an issue. Putting it up to 9 is probably not going to hurt a lot. And in terms of quality, this is now a 1:1. This is pretty decent. You know, we can brighten this up to see if we can spot anything nasty. Not really. I kind of like in this. It's pretty much what I was looking for in terms of, you know, overall light level for being split up into its individual bits. Now would be the time where you might tweak a material like this, possibly, if you weren't happy with the way the plastic was looking, because you're not going to be able to fix refractions in post necessarily, or there are ways, but you know, there are some things that should be done in here. Don't get me wrong, everything shouldn't be done in post, but you know, overall, yeah, pretty happy, to be honest. You know, compared to the quality we had before, that's a slight improvement. And okay, we've gone from 44 seconds to 7 minutes, but 7 minutes to render a frame is not so long. You know, am I happy? Let me get it to 1:1. You should be able to do this by pushing O on the keyboard, but half the time in this view it doesn't work, and the reason you need it at 1:1 is so you can check anti-aliasing, basically. Alright, so I'm going to call myself quite happy with this quality. I don't want to work in Photoshop in this little mini image, however. So I am going to come in and go to the common attributes, and let's do at least HD 720. Okay, so re-render this, and I'll come back and we'll save out those passes, of which there's many ways to do. Again, we're going to look at the simplest way to do it. So once you've re-rendered this at home, or you know, you can use mine and render mine, whichever you prefer, you'll be left with a series of passes that will just save out and open up in Photoshop. So I will be back in the next part when this render's finished. Thank you for watching. I really hope you're enjoying this series. And I will see you in the last and final part. Cheers. Hi, welcome back. So I've finished our render here, and you might notice we're at a slightly different camera angle. Now what I've done is change the camera angle from basically here where it was to just down here. After looking at it, I preferred a more shallow shot, so more flat towards the floor, looking towards the horizon, as opposed to a more top-down one. I've also made one other tweak which you can't actually see in this image, and that tweak was I've added another reflection card. So like this one we made here that has no emit diffuse, I've just made another one of those here that also has no emit diffuse. So basically it's a bigger light behind our main light, behind our key light, and all it's doing is acting as a reflection card. So it's got an exposure of 12 as opposed to an exposure of 11, and exactly the same principle for the reason we built this one, to pick up on those spec highlights, is why I put this one here. I just felt after seeing the render in quite a larger view, there's not really enough spec on this clear perspex here. So after adding that light, we go, sorry, that's with the light and that's without. So as you can see, it's just added a little more spec here to our perspex. It's basically acting as a reflection card. So same principle, really. The same, reason we put this one in here to catch specular highlights along this, we put them in here to catch some more spec here, some more spec here, as you can see when I flick backwards and forwards. And that's obviously going to be reflected on our AOVs here. So, we're going to have more spec in our direct and indirect specular. So now we've got these AOVs, we need to put them together in Photoshop. And it's very simple to do this without, getting too technical. You can just go File, Save Image, and then save this one as the beauty, and go on down the list saving them out. So quite simple to do. So you've got the direct diffuse, you would go File, Save, save it as direct diffuse, save. Obviously you won't have these, I've saved these out for a previous thing. Direct specular, save image, and direct spec. You also don't have to give them these names. The names are not important, just as long as you know what they are. So I'll pause and save out the rest of these and be back in Photoshop where we'll open them up. So I've gone ahead and saved all those out, and I can't remember whether I mentioned in a previous part, if you're using something that supports it like Nuke, you can just save a multi-layered EXR, and that will save all one EXR with all of these parts in it. So let's go ahead and open this up in Photoshop. So we'll bring them all in together. Let's see, we need a Z pass, which would be this one, and we need the subsurface scattering and the refraction. So let's open all those up together, and you should see them in Photoshop. Now our goal here is to get everything back together so it resembles the beauty pass, because if we look in Maya, here we go, Maya, then we should be seeing an image in Photoshop that's identical to this. So as you can see we are. So we want to take all of these layers now and stack them on top of each other until they're exactly the same as the beauty pass. That's the reason we saved the beauty pass out. We have something in comparison. If our images are not identical, something's gone horribly wrong. So we'll start with the direct diffuse as a base layer, and it really doesn't matter which order these layers are in right now. So we'll just take this one, I'm going to surround it, Control C, Control V, done. Now obviously that's not looking like a spec highlight on top of this, so we need to change the blending mode here to linear dodge, which is an addition mode, a plus operation. You always want to be adding or plus to a composite. So you always want to make sure that layers going on top of each other are added together to form the final image. This would be a plus operation in Nuke and addition in Photoshop. So you can see that's brought some of our specular now, some of our direct specs. So if I flick that off, you'll see it disappear. Okay, now let's get the indirect diffuse. This would be the indirect lighting contribution. So let's whack that on there, and again, plus operation, or addition in this case. Indirect specular, and Control plus operation, there we go, and refraction, in we go. And I'm just going to paste that one again, and add. So as you can see, we're just adding all these layers together. So you'll see the addition of that one brought our refraction in. Without it, we're just rendering on black, basically. So we've got subsurface scattering here. Let's just Control C and Control V on top of this and add it. And now we can see what actual contribution our subsurface scattering makes. Well, in this case, not a huge amount, but we can tweak it later. And then we've got the Z depth, which appears to be nothing at all. There is actually something here, we just can't see it, as I believe I demonstrated inside Maya. So let's add a simple exposure node. Will be fine for this, I should think, and just lower the exposure on it until we can start to see the image. I might use a little bit of offset here to make that a bit darker at the front. There we go. That should about do it, I should think. So I'm going to layer, where are we? Layer, merge visible, just to flatten that down. And then I'm going to copy this one, and I'm not going to paste it into the layers here. I'm going to paste it into the channels. So a new channel, this will act as an alpha channel, which will allow us to do a more accurate lens blur. So let's add one here. Control V, of course. Yeah, slight brain freeze there. And I'm not really liking this one. I'd like it a bit darker at the front. So, you know, it is really no trouble to do it again. Sometimes a bit of trial and error is in order with these things. So let's go exposure and just crank it down just a little bit so it gets darker at the front. That should about do it. And of course, you know, when you're using this to blur your image, you might find you need to make some tiny adjustments. But again, this is, you know, something that takes a matter of a few seconds generally. Channels, let's just dump this one in the garbage and add another one, and there we go. That should be a little better. Yeah, still not coming in quite as dark, but yeah, we should be able to work with that. Alright, fine. We'll see how we get on there. As I said, might need a little bit of tweaking. Right, so what can we do with this now? We've got it in all these layers that we couldn't do before. So let's just check we are identical to the beauty pass. We are. So what we've done is taken a combination of AOVs or render layers, and we've put them back together to form the beauty pass. We can get rid of the beauty now, and we can get rid of most of these other images so we're not all cluttered up here. So why would we do this? You know, why not just work on the beauty pass itself? Well, the reason for that is quite simple. If I come in and view just our, let's say, specular layer, let's move the specular layers together. So we've got this one and this one. So this would be the direct spec, I believe, and this is, yeah, you can see this is the indirect spec because it has color bleed. So you've got both of these specular layers. Now, let's say you have too much specular highlights, too much direct specular highlight. You can now turn it down. Okay, so rather than mucking about in Maya for half an hour, adding a bit more spec, you have direct control over your specular. You have direct control over how much indirect illumination is in the scene. So I mean, if you wanted much more indirect illumination, you can, of course, and I'm not going to go through a Photoshop lesson here. I'm going to assume you guys know how to do, you know, things in Photoshop. It's a fairly common program. So if I wanted more indirect illumination, I can expose that layer a bit more, and you see we've got these nice reddish color bleed now that goes a lot further than it did. So this gives us, you know, a fantastic degree of control over this image. You know, I can turn my refraction on and off. I can lower the opacity of my refraction to make tinted windows or, you know, slightly tinted Lego bricks. You know, in an ideal world, we would also have masks for all of this, so we could tint just the headlights, or we could tint just these blocks, but that's getting a bit far on down the path. I just wanted to go over the simple process of taking an image, splitting it up, and putting it back together. So I'm actually not going to do a lot to this. I might, for my own personal portfolio, tweak it a bit, but I'm just going to assume that you guys know how to adjust levels and exposure and do basic color grading in Photoshop. If not, we have some tutorials on the site that go over color grading in Nuke if you'd rather go down that way, and there are many helpful examples on the internet of how to do the basics of Photoshop. So, you know, I want to keep this more Maya focused. So we've got our image together, and we've got it pretty identical to how it was in Maya. We've got the control now. Don't want any spec on this image. Done. It's off. I've got a flat color image with no spec. I want just direct spec. So done. You know, I want to turn off the indirect specular highlight. I want to come in and adjust the exposure or the levels or whatnot of the indirect specular highlight. All of these things are now possible. So, you know, if you've used Photoshop before, which I'm almost sure 99% of you will have done, to edit photographs, you should be seeing almost instantly how much more control this would give you over the photo editing process than just trying to work on that beauty pass. And indeed, within the industry, it's never done as a single render and hasn't been for quite some time. So this is why I've added this to the fundamentals course, because at this present point in time, it is fundamental to know how to do this. It is part of the basic rendering process. Alright, so enough of me yakking on. So, as I said, I'm not going to take the time to do much with this. I'm going to flatten it now, and I'm just going to do a quick depth of field to show you how that Z depth works. So image, and we'll just go up to, actually we'll convert this to a 16-bit image, because I don't believe Photoshop's blurring tools work on 32-bit image, or not the lens blur anyway. And to do this, we're going to have to merge the image together, which is fine. You'll see that this is lit up with one of these HDR toning presets. Use one by all means if you want to, but you can actually see the massive amount of information available in a 32-bit image. So one of the reasons we save these out as 32-bit images is when we come to edit those individual layers, there's so much information there to work with, whereas if you would try to do this on an 8-bit image, you'd be out of luck. You'd start blowing out areas. It just wouldn't work. So, if you like a HDR toning preset, by all means use one. If you just want the image back to exactly where it was, then you just want to come here and put the exposure to 0 and the gamma to 1. Now, this time you can add a little exposure, but you can also, do that at any other time. So, I might add a little exposure here, just a touch. As I say, if I was working on this for a personal project, I would have gone in and tweaked those layers to get exactly the look I was going for. That's why we have them. But for the sake of the tutorial, we had an image, we chopped it up, we put it back together in Photoshop, we exactly matched the beauty pass, and now we're just going to do a little lens blur with this Z depth, which we should still have as an alpha channel, which we do. Okay, so let's go for it. Let's filter, blur. Let's do a lens blur. I believe is probably the best case scenario for this. And I've had one that was already set up, so let's just turn this radius right down so this speeds up. There we go. And you see we can't see much blur. Now, a pretty easy way here, or at least it's helped me in the past, to figure out where your blur is going to be, and it's not 100%, is to turn the noise all the way up. And when you don't see noise, you won't have any blur. So at the moment, we see noise absolutely everywhere. So you just adjust the focal distance up until you're not seeing that noise anymore. So you can see here that this car will be fairly blurry, but so would this one. So we're going up, up, up in the focal distance till we get a minimum amount of noise on the front of this car. And that's kind of a minimum amount of noise. So let's turn the noise off. Okay, come on. Turn off. Alright, that seems to be playing. Yeah, so I'm going to leave a little bit of noise. A little bit of noise never hurt anyone. And then I'm going to increase the radius of this, which you will see will start to blur the background. Whoops, it takes some time. I've got it on more accurate instead of preview, but you can see this background really blurring in right now. And this car really blurring in, and it seems like we've caught the front end of this one, so we've probably got a radius that's far too big. There we go. You see this one pop back into focus. We are blurry here, a bit more maybe, and okay, so there we would have a depth of field, but I don't like it. As I said before, I don't think this image is enough black in the foreground here, so I'm going to do levels on this. Adjustments, levels, and I'm going to make it darker in the foreground. Which way are we going? Okay, that should do it. And then I'll try that blur again. As I mentioned, bit of trial and error with this. It's better if you're going to be doing, especially if you're going to be doing sequence of images, to use something like After Effects and Nuke. They have slightly better tools for this. I probably mentioned before that I would normally use Nuke for this, and I'm not too too savvy on getting it done in Photoshop with a lens blur. I have done it before, of course, but you know, I would generally use Nuke. Although that said, you know, for a still shot like this, Photoshop is more than good enough, more than you need, really. Let's just go faster for a second. Okay, now you can see we're getting much more blur in the background, and this guy is much more in focus. So kind of what we wanted. Let's turn the radius down a bit. Okay, are you going to process that and down a bit more, depending on how much depth of field effect that you want. I want quite a bit in this particular image. Let's turn that to more accurate, and then we'll select OK, and then we'll have our depth of field. Little more maybe. It can't resist a bit of depth of field, you know. And that should do it. So let's just click OK. And there we have one image that's been chopped up, put apart, and has depth of field on it. And that image is actually this size. I rendered it out at full 1080. Now, you know, I'm sure you guys know what can be done in Photoshop. This was just a little demonstration of how easy it is to get that data out of Maya. You know, generally add a little something like a contrast S-curve here to just pull that down and then pop that out like so, which gives us just a boost in contrast. Hundreds of little tips and tricks and techniques for editing photos in Photoshop. I'm not going to get into it. It's a broadly covered subject, and you know, I want to keep this Maya focused on rendering rather than post-production. But I do believe that the step of cutting up your image and bringing it into either Photoshop, Nuke, After Effects, or a similar program and putting it back together, that's not post-production, that's part of the rendering process. At least it should be part of your workflow. If it's not, try and make it part of your workflow. It will pay dividends in the long run. There is a lot of flexibility you can add to it with masking and material ID passes and genuine depth passes, and you know, lots and lots of other things you can do with this. You know, calculating vectors for motion blur and stuff like this. But I wouldn't consider that fundamental. I would consider that a slightly more intermediate to advanced kind of thing. But this, just cutting up images, putting it back together, giving yourself that control in even Photoshop is essential for the rendering pipeline. Alright, so I hope you found this interesting. I hope you learned something. If you liked it, give me a shout, or if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, david@simplymaya.com, my email, or you can give me a shout if you didn't like it, of course, and tell me why. That's fine also. You can post on our forum over at simplymaya.com if you have any questions. We've some great people over there that help people out, so you know, if there's anything you need to know, feel free to jam a question in the forum, feel free to ask me directly. Alright, so thanks very much for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next tutorial.